The world that evening was a held breath, a vast and patient thing settling into blue shadow. Yeah, about to cross a threshold into a winter carved from memory. It is the winter spoken of in the fragile pages of diaries, carried in voices that soften with age. It is the winter recounted beside the iron glow of a stove, long after the flames have sighed into ash. Tonight, we will not merely observe this winter. We will feel its chill seep into our bones. We will hear its wind find every seam and weakness. This is the story of a blizzard from a distant decade. It is the story of how that blizzard tested the sinew of a single family. It tested the fragile threads of hope that bind people together. It tested the steadfast rhythm of the human heart. Before we begin, I extend a welcome to you, wherever you may be. Perhaps you are watching from across the darkened cities of the United States. You might be nestled beneath heavy blankets in the deep quiet of Canada. You could be in the hushed late hours of Europe, where night holds a different texture. Or perhaps you are listening from a place where the day is just beginning, or has already ended. No matter the hour on your clock, no matter the sky outside your window, you are here. I invite you to become a part of this gathering. If the story moves you, let me know with a like, a subscription. Share the landscape of your own thoughts in the comments below. Tell me the name of the place you are watching from. Tell me the hour at which your night truly begins. Tell me how tales of endurance and warmth make you feel in your quiet moments. Now, let us prepare to step into this world together. Take a slow breath. Let the light in your room grow dim and soft. Allow the busy noise of the day to recede, to fade into a distant murmur. Feel the weight you carry settle, if only for a little while. Match your breathing to the slow, gentle rhythm we will set. Inhale, deeply and slowly. Exhale, releasing all that is hurried. We are stepping into a realm of frost and candle flame. We are entering a story of resilience, of deepened, abiding family warmth. And now, let us travel back to the very beginning. Let us return to the precise moment when the great storm first stirred from its slumber. That final morning began in a silence so complete it felt like a held note. The prairie lay under a weak December sun, a disk of pale gold in a washed minus-out sky. The land was a vast and open hand, its lines softened by a thin scatter of snow from the previous night. It was a powder so fine it lifted with the slightest sigh of wind. Inside the wooden homestead, life moved with the deliberate pace of established routine. The air was rich with the scent of pine logs, stacked neatly beside the hearth. It carried the humble, sweet smell of cornmeal porridge warming on the iron stove. Mary Carter stood at the window, her palms resting lightly on the cold sill. Her breath bloomed upon the frosted glass, a transient ghost that vanished almost as it formed. Beyond the pane, the horizon seemed to waver, blurred by a haze like pearlescent mist. The stillness outside was not peaceful. It was a waiting stillness, tense and expectant, as if the sky were gathering its strength. Behind her, a small hand tugged at the hem of her apron. Young Clara looked up, humming a wordless tune to herself. Clutched in her arms was a rag doll, its face stitched with care just the week before. On the wide minus-planked floor, Henry, the youngest, pushed a carved wooden horse. Its small wheels made a soft, rhythmic click-minus-clack as it rolled over the boards. Outside, the steady thwack of an axe split the cold air. James Carter worked with practiced efficiency, splitting wood for the fire. Yet even he paused in his labor, his gaze drifting northward. There, a darker band of clouds had begun to gather. They moved not with speed, but with the inevitable drift of a slow, rising tide. The first snowflakes were a gentle afterthought. They descended like wandering feathers, tapping almost apologetically against the window. They were delicate, harmless, beautiful in their solitude. But Mary felt a change in the quality of the air. It grew thicker, heavier, as if sound itself were being swallowed by the gathering damp. She leaned closer to the glass, her eyes narrowing. The flakes multiplied, thickening from a stray few into a steady, silent curtain. A wind awoke, sighing through the dry prairie grass. It threaded thin, whistling fingers through the gaps in the wooden siding. James entered not long after, bringing a gust of chilled air with him. He brushed crystalline powder from his shoulders. That came in faster than I reckoned, he murmured, pushing the door firmly shut against the rising push of the wind. Mary nodded, her hands already moving to stir the banked fire into stronger life. It feels like the start of something, she said, her voice low. James placed a solid, reassuring hand on her shoulder. We've weathered storms before, but his own eyes betrayed a flicker of caution as he glanced back at the window. The world beyond was being erased, line by line, behind a thickening veil of white. Inside, the children continued their play, wrapped in innocent oblivion. They did not know that the first, whispering words of the longest winter they would ever know had already begun to fall. By the time afternoon began to lean toward evening, the gentle drift had transformed. It became a relentless, unbroken cascade. The flakes were no longer delicate, they were thick, heavy, and ceaseless. They tumbled from a sky the color of tarnished pewter. The vast, open land was shrinking, consumed by a pale, swirling blur. Fences, the outline of the distant barn, the dark line of trees at the property's edge, all were swallowed. The Carter homestead stood isolated, wrapped in the first tight folds of the coming tempest. Within the cabin, the hearth breathed waves of dry warmth into the room. Yet that comfort now felt fragile, diminished, as if the house itself sensed the shift. The walls emitted faint creaks, expanding and contracting with each new gust. James had moved to the storage corner, a place of quiet inventory. He examined sacks of oats, cloth minus wrapped parcels of salt pork, jars of preserves. His brow was lightly furrowed as he took silent stock. Enough for a few days, certainly. Perhaps a week, if they were careful. The prairie blizzards were not mere weather. They were elemental forces. They arrived with a will of their own. At the rough hewn kitchen table, Clara watched him, her all held tightly to her chest. "Is it a big storm, Papa?" she asked, her voice a small, careful thing. James offered a smile, though it did not quite reach the concern in his eyes. "It's just a bit of winter wind," he replied. "We'll be warm and snug in here." As if in direct defiance, the wind outside rose suddenly. It deepened into a long, low howl, mournful and hungry. It threaded through every crack, a wild creature pacing the perimeter of their shelter. It rattled the shutters in their frames. It moaned a low note against the chimney stone. It found every unseen seam, every minute weakness in the boards, and pressed its frigid breath through them. Henry looked up from his wooden horse, his eyes wide. "Papa," he whispered, "the wind's talking." Mary, her hands deep in bread dough, smiled a soft, practiced smile. She brushed a stray curl from her forehead with her wrist. "It's only the winter singing by," she said, "heard on a bomb. Sometimes the wind likes to remind us it's alive." Another gust slammed against the house, stronger than the last, so strong that a fine spray of snow sifted in through the window frame's tiny gap. It dusted the cell with a glittering frost. James set down the jar he had been holding. "I'll secure the barn doors," he said, already reaching for his heavy coat. "If this picks up, the animals will need everything shut tight." Harry's hand paused in its meeting. "Be quick," she whispered, the words barely audible. Outside, the world had become an abstraction of white. When James stepped onto the porch, the snow whipped across his face like shards of icy silk. The wind roared around him, a physical pressure against his chest. It stole the breath from his lips with its ferocity. He squinted toward the barn, now only a darker smudge in the swirling chaos. Steadying himself against the porch railing, he pushed forward into the blur. Inside, the children had grown quiet, listening. The house trembled gently under the storm's assault, a humble reminder. The prairie winds answered to no one, respected no boundary. Harry fed the fire, the fresh logs catching with a welcome roar. The resulting glow washed across the room in a warm wave, an effort to make the space feel certain, safe. "Come sit close," she said, gathering the children near the hearth's radiance. For the storm was no longer whispering. It had found its full voice, and it had begun to speak. James returned from the barn crusted in white, a statue of winter. His hair was dusted like powdered frost, and his breath came in sharp, visible bursts. He pushed the door closed with effort, leaning his way into the wood as if against a living foe. When the latch finally clicked home, The cabin seemed to exhale, sinking back into its dim, warm cocoon. Mary hurried to him, brushing snow from his shoulders with urgent hands. "It's worsening," James murmured, shaking his head slightly. "Could barely see my own boots in front of me." He moved to the hearth, extending his hands toward the flames. He let the fire's dry heat seep into his child's skin. Clara and Henry watched him with solemn faces. A child's instinct is sharp. They could feel the weight in the air, the new gravity in their parents' silence. Outside, the sky had dissolved entirely. Snow swept across the prairie in endless, shifting sheets. Each gust folded into the next until there was no beginning, no end, only motion, only cold. The windows had begun to frost from the inside. Delicate, icy ferns spread their crystal patterns across the glass. The house dimmed as the day sank toward a premature dusk. Though time added little now, the storm wrote its own rules of light and dark. Terry returned to her bread dough, her movement slower, more thoughtful. She pressed her palms into the soft, yielding mass, a rhythm that was steady and grounding. The smell of rising yeast and warmth helped to soften the edge of the wind's howl. It filled the home with a scent of normalcy, a memory of calm routine. James spoke again, his voice low near the fire. "The barn doors held. Animals are sheltered. But if this keeps up," he let the sentence fade unfinished, carried away by the wind's rising moan. Terry nodded, her hands never pausing. "We'll manage. We always do." Children had returned to their rug. Clara braided her doll's yarn hair with intense concentration. Henry pushed his wooden horse in slow, lazy circles. But every so often, Henry would glance up, his eyes seeking the window as if expecting the storm to peer back in. A sudden, violent gust struck the house, rattling the beams overhead. A fine spray of snow sifted down from a crack along a ceiling seam. It drifted like glitter through the lamplight before settling on the table. Clara's eyes grew wide. "Mama," she said, pointing. "The snow's coming in." Mary reached up instinctively, her fingertips brushing the cold seam. "Just a draft," she assured, though a trace of worry now touched her expression. James fetched a rag and tucked it firmly into the gap, pressing until the wind's breath was reduced to a faint, frustrated whisper. Night approached with a stealthy creep. The storm made it feel as though true darkness had already claimed the world. The wind wailed, rising and falling like the surf of a frozen, distant ocean. Snow piled higher against the house, muffling sound, smothering shape. It sealed the family deeper into their winter refuge. Harry lit another lantern. Its amber glow spilled like liquid honey across the table and floor. "We'll have supper soon," she said. Her voice was warm, calm, steady an anchor amid the storm's relentless push. Outside, the world vanished under drifts that grew with each passing hour. Snow without end, winter without mercy. But inside, the Carters drew their circle tighter. Every heartbeat within the warm walls was a quiet promise. They would face the storm not as individuals but as one. Evening arrived without ceremony, without a sunset. It was merely a slow dimming, as if a great hand were gently lowering the world's wick. Outside, the blizzard swirled with undiminished fury. Wind whipped snow into spinning whirls that beat against the walls like a frantic, insistent drum. The house creaked in reply, each board bending slightly under the constant pressure. Harry ladled warmth into balls, the rich smell of beans and pork filling the room. It was the smell of comfort, of heaviness, of sustenance. The children settled by the hearth, blankets wrapped around their small shoulders. The fire painted their cheeks with a soft, dancing gold. James sat nearby, sharpening a small hatchet. The gentle, rhythmic scrape of metal on stone was a steadying sound. It was a counterpoint to the wind's chaotic chorus. As they ate, the storm surged again. A deep roar pressed against the shutters, making them tremble. Henry paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "It sounds angry," he whispered. Harry reached over and tucked the blanket more snugly around him. "It's only winter blowing itself out," she murmured. "Storms always shout loudest before they grow tired." But James knew better. He had seen prairie storms that lasted for days, sometimes stretching into weeks. Storms that buried wagons and outbuildings without a trace. storms that chilled a man to his marrow and erased paths from the land. He exchanged a glance with Mary. It was a look that spoke entire sentences without a single word. After the meal, the children curled together on a thick old quilt. It was a pattern of faded blues and browns, sewn by Mary's mother years ago. Its familiar texture was a comfort beneath their small palms. Mary hummed a slow, old hymn. Her voice, soft and steady, wove an additional warmth into the room. The fire crackled and popped in sympathetic rhythm. James went to the window. He wiped away a circle of frost with the edge of his sleeve. He yawned the glass. There was no world. No trees, no sky, no horizon. Only shifting white, swirling like dense smoke, endless and impenetrable. The wind tugged at the shutters as if trying to pry them open with frozen fingers. He let the curtain fall back into place and returned to the hearth. The warmth there felt deeper now, richer, as though the fire knew it was being asked to stand guard through a long and uncertain vigil. Here he rose to check the kitchen lamp. "We'll let this one run until midnight," she said, adjusting the wick with a practiced touch. "After that, we'll conserve what we can." James nodded. Oil was not infinite. The storm would not respect the passing of a single night. As the hours slipped by, the blizzard showed no sign of weakening. Snow piled higher along the outside walls, packing tightly. It was still in the house like a cocoon woven from ice. The sound grew strangely muffled yet more forceful. It was a contradiction only the fiercest winter storms could embody. Claire had drifted into sleep first, her body curling like a kitten beneath the quilt. Henry followed, his wooden horse clutched gently in a loose hand. Harry and James sat together by the fire, shoulders touching, eyes heavy. The flames danced slowly, and their shadows swayed across the room like gentle, wavering sentinels. "It'll be a long night," James murmured, the words thick with fatigue. Mary rested her head against the solid warmth of his shoulder. "Then we'll face every hour of it," she answered, her voice barely a whisper. Outside, the night deepened. Snow fell. Wind howled. The prairie disappeared into a white wilderness. And inside the little homestead, the Carters held tightly to three things: warmth, togetherness, the fragile, stubborn hope that morning would eventually bring calm. Sometime in the deep, silent hours past midnight, the storm shifted its voice. Furious, relentless howling softened. But this was not a kindness. It became a low, steady hiss. It was as if the entire world were now wrapped in layers of dense cotton, muffling every sound. This was a silence that felt heavy, watchful, and profoundly uneasy. James stirred in his chair by the fire, his neck stiff from an awkward sleep. The heat from the flames had faded to a bed of glowing embers. They winked slowly in the darkness like drowsy red eyes. Beside him, Mary was half-minus asleep, her head resting against the chair's arm. His was illuminated by the dim, pulsing orange light. He rose quietly, his joints protesting. He added more wood to the stove. The new logs crackled as they caught, flames licking upward with renewed vigor. The warmth returned in gentle, creeping waves across the wooden floor. He listened. There was nothing but the faint, almost ghostly rustle of snow shifting somewhere outside. It was the sound he feared most in a blizzard's aftermath. The quiet moment when the snowfall thickens and the world becomes buried beneath its own immense stillness. Mary stirred slightly. "Is it morning?" she whispered, her voice scratchy with sleep. James shook his head, though she likely couldn't see it clearly. Still the middle of the night. The storms changed. Mary blinked, pushing herself upright. "How? Quieter?" he said. "Too quiet." She rubbed her hands together, seeking warmth. "Snow's packing in. We may be buried by morning." James swallowed, not wishing to feed her worry, though the same thought had taken root in his own mind. The house buried in snow was not uncommon on the prairie, but it meant isolation deep, profound, and unshakable. It meant a cold that would have to be fought with unbroken vigilance. Across the room, Clara murmured in her sleep, shifting under the quilt. Henry lay sprawled beside her, his tiny hands still curled around his wooden horse. Harry smiled softly at the sight, despite the dread the quiet brought. "They sleep like angels in winter," she whispered. James returned the smile, but his eyes held the worry his lips would not speak. Let's check the door. Together, they moved quietly to the front entry. James took the handle and tugged. He felt immediate, solid resistance. It was the unmistakable pressure of snow piled high against the outside. The door did not budge, not even a fraction of an inch. A tremor of unease traveled up Mary's spine. Her sealed in already. James pressed his shoulder to the door, testing its strength again. The snow held firm, dense, and unmoving. "We'll dig out when it's daylight," he said. His voice, a crafted calm, was steady. Carefully placed, a tone meant for Mary and for the sleeping children. Mary nodded. The fear fluttered at the edge of her breath. She touched the door lightly, feeling the intense cold pulsing through the wood. Back at the hearth, the revived fire warmed the room. It cast a soft, defiant light over every familiar object. The braided rug, the tin cups on the shelf, the wooden rocking chair. All were small, glowing pieces of their life, while the world outside disappeared under drifts taller than a man. James placed another log on the fire. "They'll be all right," he said, more gently now. "We've seen winters before." Terry looked at him, her eyes searching his in the flickering light. "Never one quite like this," she said quietly. He didn't answer. He let the fire speak for him, its flames dancing steadily, promising warmth for a little while longer. The storm silence pressed in, deeper and thicker. It felt as though the house was floating in a sea of white stillness. The Carters were safe, warm, sheltered together. But outside, the longest winter continued to build its formidable walls around them. Then morning finally arrived. It did so without fanfare, without brightness. The room remained in a muted, gray half-minus light. The air held a persistent chill that seeped through unseen cracks. Normally, a prairie sunrise cast a pearly glow, even in deep winter, but on this day, the dawn felt swallowed, hidden behind something denser and heavier than mere cloud. Mary woke first. She blinked slowly, adjusting to the gloom. For a disorienting moment, she wondered if the lamp had failed. Then she understood. It was the world outside that had changed. She crossed the room and touched James's shoulder. He stirred, rubbing a hand over his face. He frowned at the persistent darkness around them. "Is it earlier than we thought?" he murmured, his voice husky. Mary shook her head. "Listen." They paused together, holding their breath. There was no wind, no movement, only a deep, hushed, smothering stillness. James went to the window. He brushed away a film of frost with his thumb. But instead of sky or trees, or even swirling snow, he saw nothing. A flat, solid wall of white pressed against the glass. It was as though the window had been sealed behind a slab of ice. "We're snowed under," he said quietly, the words definitive. Harry moved beside him, her own breath catching softly. The snow wasn't merely piled high. It buried the house, packed with dense, smothering pressure against every inch of the walls. Henry awoke next, stretching and blinking sleepily. "Mama," he asked, his voice small in the gloom, "why is it still nighttime?" Clara sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. Did the sun forget today? Harry gathered them close, pulling them into the circle of her arms. "The storm left a great deal of snow behind," she explained, her tone deliberately light. "That's all. The sun is there, just hidden for a little while." James was already examining the door again. He pushed against it gently. There was no movement, no give whatsoever. The snow was too heavy, too tightly packed. "We'll need to dig out through the window," he thought aloud. The upper pane might give way easier. But Mary touched his arm. A light, restraining pressure. "Not yet. Let's wait until the storm settles completely. The walls of snow may shift." James nodded, though reluctance was in the set of his jaw. The last thing they needed was an avalanche of snow bursting into the room. Instead, he lit a second lantern and set it on the table. The combined flames pushed back the lingering gloom, painting the children's faces in warm, amber tones. Thackeray began preparing breakfast. Simple biscuits baked on the stove's flat iron top. Their humble, wholesome aroma spread through the house. It was a comforting, familiar smell that reminded everyone that even buried beneath winter's wrath, life inside continued. It persisted with a gentle, stubborn normalcy. Henry sat near the hearth with his horse, tracing imaginary trails on the floorboards. Clara curled beside Mary, watching the biscuits rise. The warmth from the stove brushed her cheeks. "Will we be stuck here long?" Clara asked, her voice quiet. Mary looked at her daughter's wide, questioning eyes. She brushed a strand of hair from Clara's forehead. "Not forever, sweet girl. Just until nature tires itself out." James added, his voice gentle and sure. "And we're safe. That's what matters most." Outside, the prairie lay in utter silence. It was blanketed beneath drift so deep that even fence posts had vanished. Only smooth, unbroken white hills stretched endlessly, hiding every familiar shape. The blizzard had passed, but its legacy remained heavy, deep, and absolute. Inside, lantern light flickered. The fire crackled. The Carters breathed in the warmth that separated them from the frozen world. Unable to see the sun, they marked morning by the rhythm of their home. The simmer of the stove, the scent of baking, the soft, vital comfort of each other's presence. After breakfast, James climbed onto a chair beneath the loft window. It was the highest point in the house. He pressed his palm flat against the cold glass. It was colder than any morning he could remember. He exhaled, fogging the pain, then used his sleeve to clear a small circle. The view was unchanged. Oh, a vast, featureless whiteness pressed directly against the window. It was packed so tightly, it resembled a wall of solid marble. Dury stood behind him, her hands clasped anxiously. "How deep do you think it is?" James leaned closer, squinting at the edges where faint gradations suggested layers. "Snow upon snow," he murmured, "compressed by wind and weight. Could be 6 feet, maybe more." He paused, his voice dropping. "To be all the way to the roof line." Mary felt a tight pinch in her chest. The thought of their home lying beneath the prairie's surface was unsettling, like a shipwreck under ice. But she steadied herself, lifting her chin. "We're warm," she whispered. The words a declaration. "We have food. We'll outlast it." James turned to her, touching her arm gently. "We always do." Below them, the children played softly. Thera hummed to her doll. Henry built a small fortress from kindling sticks. The fire glowed bright. Its released warmth, a comforting promise. Souls had not conquered everything within these walls. James climbed down, his boots thumping softly on the floor. He retrieved an iron poker and tapped it gently against one of the lower windows. A hollow, muffled thud answered him. It was the sound of tapping the inside of a snow-minus-covered cave. Thighs shivered involuntarily. "It's like the world has disappeared." "Just hidden," James corrected quietly. "Not gone." Still, the heaviness of the snow outside seemed to press inward. It pressed against the walls, against the windows, against their very thoughts. Even within the warm cabin, its weight settled over them like a silent, watchful presence. Harry lit a third lantern and set it on the mantel. But the sun swallowed behind the drifts. Every flame was a precious defiance. James fetched their tools, an old spade, a wooden minus-handled shovel, a small hand-minus axe. He laid them neatly by the door, a preparation for when it would be safe to dig. Mary watched him work, her hands smoothing her apron in slow, anxious circles. "Not yet," he said again, his voice gentle but firm. Snows too fresh, could collapse inward. Just then, a muffled creak sounded above them. It was soft but distinct, the sound of deep, settling snow. Clara froze, her doll poised in mid-minus air. "Mama," she whispered. "What was that?" Mary forced a calm smile. "Just the snow settling, dear. It's like the earth taking that deep, slow breath." Henry looked up at the ceiling, his small brow furrowed. With it fallenness, James knelt beside him, placing a steadying hand on his small shoulder. "No, son. These rafters are strong as oak, built to last." He tapped the overhead beam with his knuckle, producing a reassuring, solid thud. "This house is tougher than any storm." Satisfied, Henry returned to his wooden horse, pushing it across the floor with soft, rhythmic clicks. As the morning faded into a dim, timeless afternoon, the house remained wrapped in its snowy cocoon. The lanterns glowed. The fire hummed. Mary prepared a stew for later, her hands moving methodically. Each chop, each stir, seemed to stitch a little more calm into the air. James worked quietly, reinforcing the firewood pile inside. He checked seams for drafts, listened for any shift in the pressure from outside. The house felt smaller now, a warm, breathing bubble in a cold, silent sea. But the Carters stayed close. Their voices were low and warm. Their hearts were steady. The storm had entombed them in white, but inside, life pulsed gently. It refused to be quieted. As the afternoon slipped toward what should have been evening, the Carters made a strange discovery. Time itself had begun to lose its definition. Without sunlight, without the gradual shift of shadows across the floorboards, the day felt suspended. It was soft and untoward, floating like a leaf in perfectly still water. Mary glanced at the clock on the wall. Its pendulum swung with its usual metronomic certainty. The hands moved in their steady arc, but the world around the clock felt unmoving, frozen. "I keep expecting the light to change," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone. James nodded, carefully adjusting a lantern wick. "We'll have to mark our hours by habit instead of the sun." He placed the lantern near the table, then lit another. He set the second one on the counter near the stove. Their soft, golden glows merged and spread. They warmed the walls with light, pushing back the muted grayness that seeped from the corners. Clara and Henry watched, fascinated, as the flames danced inside their glass chimneys. "It's like little suns," Clara said softly. James smiled at the observation. "Exactly. And everyone helps us hold on to our day." The children stayed near the fire, the warm air brushing their cheeks. Henry clutched his wooden horse, rocking it slowly over the quilt-spattered surface. Clara braided strands of yarn into her doll's hair, humming a tune Mary had taught her the previous winter. Mary used the bright, lamplit hours to sort through their food stores once more. Jars and sacks were arranged neatly on the shelves. The flickering light played over her face, leaving gentle shadows beneath her eyes. She traced her fingers over a jar of dried apples. The gesture summoned a memory of summer warmth, of orchard trees, of sunlight de-appling through green leaves. "We'll ration carefully," she said quietly, almost to herself, "till we get out." James joined her, resting his work minus roughened hand over hers. "We will," he assured her, his voice low and certain. That the snow pressing against every wall made the house feel like its own separate world. Silent, sealed, floating somewhere outside of time. As true evening approached in the world above, a subtle wind returned. It whispered now, rather than screamed. Tiny vibrations trembled along the wooden boards. They felt like a distant, frozen heartbeat. It was a reminder. The storm still breathed, still lingered. It was still watching. Henry prepared supper, warm biscuits in the thick simmered stew. The children ate with small, contented sighs, grateful for the warmth and flavor. After the meal, James pulled out the family Bible. Its leather cover was worn smooth from years of handling. He opened it and read in a calm, steady rhythm. The verses spoke of endurance, of shelter, of the steadfastness of love. The words floated through the room like soft incense. They soothed the sharp edges of worry that clung to their thoughts. Fiery lit the last lantern of the evening and hung it from a hook near the rafters. Its glow spread wider from that height. Together, the lanterns created a warm, golden halo in the dim cabin. They wrapped the family in a gentle cocoon of amber light. "This feels like a story," Clara whispered, her eyes reflecting the flames. Mary smiled as she tucked her daughter closer. "All winters feel like stories if you listen to them closely." James stoked the fire one last time before the night's long watch. The flames rose brighter, their crackle echoing softly against the wooden walls. Outside, the world remained buried, silent, cold, unmoving. Inside, the lantern hours held the Carters safe. Each flame was a quiet promise against the long frozen night ahead. Night came gently to the buried cabin. It seemed to drift down from the ceiling rather than rise from outside. The lanterns glowed softer now, their flames flickering in slow, thoughtful rhythms. The fire had settled into a bed of deep orange embers. They pulsed like the quiet, steady heartbeat of the home itself. Everything in the room, every object, every shadow felt coated in a hush. It was a stillness that reached deeper than mere silence. Harry tucked the children into their shared quilt on the floor. She smoothed the fabric over Clara's shoulder and brushed Henry's hair from his forehead. Both children fought heavy eyelids, wanting to stay awake just a little longer. They wanted to watch the beautiful, living glow of the lanterns. "Will the snow stay on top of us all night?" Henry whispered into the warm dimmings. Mary kissed his cool cheek. "Yes, dear. But our home is strong, and we're safe inside it." Clara's voice drifted upward, barely louder than a breath. "It feels like we're under a blanket." She smiled in the semi-minus darkness. "A very big, very cold blanket. But yes, something like that." James added another piece of wood to the fire. He nudged the embers until they sparked, sending tiny flecks of gold floating upward like luminous insects. The warmth deepened, spreading across the floor and lifting the evening's chill. He settled beside Mary on the heart sign. Their shoulders touched as they watched the children finally succumb to sleep. Clara curled close to her doll. Henry loosened his grasp on his wooden horse until it rested peacefully beside him. The steady rise and fall of their small breaths filled the room with a peaceful, rhythmic music. Outside, the snow continued its slow, patient shifting. It pressed and settled against the house in weighty movements. Never sudden, never loud, just a soft, relentless reshaping of the world above them. Sometimes the snow creaked, sometimes a faint, sighing echo traveled along the roofline. That the sounds were spaced far apart, like the house itself breathing slowly in its deep, cold sleep. James spoke quietly into the dimmings. "I'll start digging tomorrow, even if it's just a small channel for air." Mary nodded, her head still resting against his shoulder. "Yes, when the snow has settled completely." They sat together in the lantern-minus lit glow. The room was warm and golden around them. Shadows from the rafters stretched long and gentle across the floor. It curved around the sleeping children like protective arms. Harry leaned into James, exhaustion pulling at her limbs. "You don't know how long it'll last," she murmured, the admissions often weary. "No," James said, his voice a calm, steady anchor against uncertainty. "But we've made it through worse than this." She smiled faintly at that. His certainty, even in the face of the unknown, was its own kind of light. The hours passed with a slow, measured tread. The lanterns dimmed as their oil dwindled. The glow faded to a quiet, amber whisper. Outside, the sky could not be seen. The stars might as well have been extinguished behind miles of snow. The prairie lay in a deep, white slumber untouched, unseen, silent. Inside the buried home, warmth remained. The air held the gentle, familiar scent of the hearth, pine smoke, the remnants of stew, faint traces of baked bread. The children slept soundly. Fire breathed. The lantern sighed their last, and James and Mary, wrapped in the soft embrace of the night beneath the snow, kept a watchful, loving vigil. They held that vigil until their own eyes grew too heavy to remain open. James awoke to a strange and unsettling sensation. It felt almost as if the house itself were breathing differently. A faint movement in the air, a soft, new press of cold against his cheek, a peculiar stillness that made every sound, even the thought of his own heart, seem preternaturally loud. The room was dim, lit only by the faint, pulsing glow of the fire's remnants. Embers had settled into deep red coals, their light barely flickering across the wooden floor. The lanterns had long since burned out. Their glass chimneys were streaked with thin, dark soot. Mary was still asleep, curled beneath her shawl. Clara and Henry lay nestled together, their quilt rising and falling with gentle, untroubled breaths. Their small faces were peaceful, soft, unburdened by the weight of the storm that still encased their home. James sat up slowly, stretching the stiffness from his limbs. The air felt colder this morning, dangerously so, but sharper. It was as if the breath of winter were leaning closer to the windows, listening. He rose quietly and crossed the room to the loft window. Frost coated the pane in delicate, crystalline patterns, feathered spirals, branching stars. Tiny, intricate forests of ice. He wiped a small patch clear with his sleeve and peered out. He saw only the same solid wall of snow, not a glimmer of daylight, not a hint of sky, just a dense, unbroken whiteness. He exhaled, and a cloud formed on the glass before fading away. Mary stirred behind him. "Is it morning already?" she asked softly, her voice still thick with sleep. "By the clock," James replied, "but outside it could be midnight for all we know." She wrapped her shawl tighter and moved to join him at the window. Tears, fingers touched the frost lightly, tracing its delicate, impossible curves. "So still," she whispered, the words hanging in the cold air. "The still," James murmured in agreement. They descended the loft ladder and began the ritual of rekindling the fire. Mary fed it small pieces of kindling, coaxing fresh flames to life with patient care. Soon, the room brightened with new warmth. An orange glow flickered over every familiar surface, reclaiming them from the gloom. Clara stretched with a sleepy groan, her all pressed tightly to her chest. "Mama," she mumbled. "Is it morning?" Harry smiled gently, the firelights softening her features. "Yes, sweetheart. The clock says so, even if the sky forgot to tell us." Henry woke moments later, rubbing his eyes and immediately clutching for his wooden horse. "Is the snow still here?" James knelt beside him, placing a steady hand on his back. "Still here," he said. "Still deep, but we're all right. We're warm." Breakfast was simple warm porridge, sweetened with a single, precious spoonful of preserved apple syrup. The children ate greedily, the warmth from the food spreading through them like a substitute for the absent sun. Afterward, James brought out the tools he had laid by the door. The small hand minus X, the shovel, the spade. He examined each blade, ensuring they were sturdy and sharp. "You digging today?" Mary asked, worry softening her voice to a near minus whisper. "Just enough to reach the surface," he said, "or at least to get air moving. We can't rely on the gaps in the snow forever." Mary nodded, though her fingers tightened reflexively around the fabric of her apron. "Be careful if the snow shifts." "I know," James said gently. He moved to the loft window once more, the highest point. "I'll start here. Higher point means less weight above us to move." He lifted the small axe and tapped it gently against the pane. It was not to break the glass, but to test the snow's resistance. The sound was dull, almost swallowed, barely echoing back to him. As he prepared to begin, Mary brought the children close to the hearth. Here her soft voice guided them into a quiet activity. They drew shapes in the frost gathered on a leftover tin sheet. She hummed a winter hymn under her breath, a sound meant to soothe. James raised the axe again, his movements slow, deliberate, thoughtful. Buried under feet of snow in a world without daylight, the Carters faced a new chapter. They would carve a breath of open air through winter's heavy, silent hand. The house held its quiet, warm courage around them, and James began to dig. James positioned himself beneath the loft window. He took a series of steadying breaths. The hand minus axe gleamed dully in the fire's soft light. The children watched from the quilt near the hearth, curiosity bright in their sleep minus softened eyes. Harry kept close to them, her presence a warm, reassuring anchor. James prepared to carve their way back toward the surface of the world. He raised the axe gently, avoiding any quick or reckless movement. Snow this deep could shift unpredictably. Here was his only ally. The first tap against the frozen pane produced a muffled thud. The sound was instantly swallowed by the dense mass beyond. He tapped again, firmer this time. The third tap sent a subtle tremor through the heavy drift. Mary straightened, her body tense. "James, go slow." "I am," he answered softly, his voice calm. "Just testing it." He adjusted his stance. Then he used the flat back of the axe head to push against the glass, not strike it. The pane held for a moment, then gave way with a soft, crystalline crack. It did not shatter. It simply slipped inward, surrendering to the outside pressure. A small spill of fine, powdered snow drifted into the room. It floated down like slow, weightless ash. The children watched, mesmerized. "It's so soft," Clara whispered, her voice full of awe. Henry reached out to touch the snow as it landed on the floor. He giggled at the cold, surprising tickle against his fingertips. James brushed aside the remaining shards of glass carefully. He leaned forward and began to scoop away the loosened snow with his hands. Beyond the empty window frame lay a wall of white, packed, heavy, and unbroken. He dug with both hands, clearing a shallow pocket in the immense drift. Bits of powdered frost clung to his eyelashes and beard. He melted instantly from the warmth of his breath. The work was agonizingly slow. Every handful he removed revealed only more snow. Thick, relentless layers built by the storm's merciless night. The deeper he scooped, the more he could feel the immense weight pressing inward. It was as if a giant hand held the house in its cold, unyielding palm. Harry stepped closer, a lantern in her hand. She cast slow waves of amber light over the small hollow James had begun to carve. "Is it safe?" she asked, her eyes scanning the exposed snow. Harsh joist, listening to the faint, settling sounds above them. "So far," he answered. "Snow's packed tight. That's good. Means it won't collapse easily." He reached for the small spade and began to chip gently at the drift. He widened the pocket bit by bit, grain by frozen grain. The children leaned forward, mesmerized by the way little crystals spilled into the room. They looked like tiny, fallen diamonds on the wooden floor. Minutes passed, then more. It was slow, meticulous, careful work. The air near the window grew perceptibly colder. Each breath James took turned into a small, clouded plume. Snow seeped down his sleeves and gathered in the folds of his coat, but he kept going, steady and patient. At last, the texture of the snow changed. It became less densely packed, slightly looser. It was a small but vital sign. "We're getting close," he murmured, the words barely a whisper. Mary let out a soft, hopeful breath, her shoulders easing a fraction. James scraped a little more, carefully, gently, and then a faint shift of brightness appeared. Not true light, but a softening of the relentless white. A thinning, then a tiny, ghostly glow seeped through. It was pale, muted, but undeniably real. Daylight filtered through feet of snow. It was as weak as the memory of a sunrise, but it was there. A small, luminous circle shone through the snowpack. It looked like the glow of a lantern held at a great distance. Henry gasped. "Papa, the sun." Clara clapped her hands together softly, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's there. It's really there." James smiled, dazed, slow, tired. Profoundly relieved smile. "We've reached the surface snow. Deeper than I hoped, but not too deep to break through." Harry let her hand rest on his shoulder, a gesture of gratitude and solidarity. "Thank God," she whispered, but the hole was still too small. It was just a dim, glowing hint of the outside world, not enough to let in fresh air. Certainly not enough for a way out. "I'll widen it," James said, resolve firming his voice. "Bit by bit, no sudden movements, just slow, steady work." Mary nodded, her own determination mirroring his. "We'll manage." And so, with lantern light glowing behind him, and faint daylight beckoning in front, James returned to his task. He carefully carved a fragile lifeline between their warm, buried home and the frozen world above. Inside, the Carters watched. Their first fragile connection to the outside had finally been forged. It glowed before them like the beginning of a promise. The faint glow behind the snow grew brighter as James worked. It was still muted, still pale, but now unmistakably daylight. Even filtered through several feet of densely packed drift, it shimmered with a soft, pearlescent quality. The children remained absolutely still as they watched. They were enchanted by this subtle change in the very air of the loft. The new brightness filled the tiny hollow with a serene, otherworldly luminescence. Henry whispered, as if in church, "It looks like the sky is breathing." Mary's lips curved into a gentle, grateful smile. "Yes," she murmured, "it's the morning saying hello to us." James dug slowly, widening the small pocket with painstaking care. Each handful of loosened snow that fell inward made a soft, whispering sound on the floorboards. The air around him grew colder with every scoop. It was as though the outside world was slipping a single, chilly finger into the warm haven of their home. Harry placed an extra log on the fire, brightening its flames to counter the invading cold. The comforting crackle filled the room, mingling with the quiet, persistent scrape of the shovel against the snow. Clara hugged her all close and leaned toward her mother. When Papa breaks through, will the snow all fall in? Harry stroked her daughter's hair, the motion soothing. No, love. He's making the opening small and careful. It will hold its shape. Clara nodded, reassured by the soft certainty in her mother's voice. James paused, brushing the accumulation of frost from his beard. The small window space was now a narrow tube, a hollow passage stretching upward into the body of the snow. It was still narrow, still pale, but undeniably connected to the day. "Feel anything?" Mary asked quietly, peering up. He held his bare hand near the top of the hollow. "A slight draft," he murmured. "Colder but steady. That's good. Means the snow above is settled. We've reached the stable layers." He widened the hole carefully, smoothing the edges with the flat of the spade. And now the faint daylight spilled into the loft in a soft, silvery shower. It wasn't bright enough to illuminate the room below, but it was a reminder, an unmistakable sign. The sky still existed beyond the heavy, white walls. Henry crawled a little closer, his face tilted upward. "Papa, can you see the outside?" Dave leaned forward, pressing his shoulder to the rough wooden frame. "Not yet," he answered. "The snow's still thick above, but we're close. Another hour or two of careful digging." His voice trailed off as a soft, deep shift came from the snow overhead. It was a muffled sound, like settling earth. Mary's breath caught. "James." He held up a hand, listening intently. The house creaked slightly under the adjusting weight. The snow was no longer loose or unstable. It was merely settling into its final firm layers. "It's holding," he said gently. "Don't worry." The children settled again, though their eyes remained wide and watchful. James continued digging. Slower now. Smooth, quiet motions that released tiny flurries of snowflakes. They drifted through the new light like soft, weightless feathers. At last the hall was deep enough that he could smell it. The faintest hint of outside air. Crisp, soiled, tinged with that sharp, clean, metallic scent of a frozen landscape. He stepped back, his shoulders sagging with tired relief. "There," he said, "the word of full sentence. We've made a breathing tunnel." Harry's eyes glistened in the combined light of fire and snow minus glow. "We can get fresh air now." James nodded. "And by tomorrow, maybe we can dig fully to the surface. But for today, this is enough." The children approached the loft, climbing carefully up the ladder with Mary behind them. They peered into the thin tunnel of pale light, their faces glowing in its reflection. Clara whispered, her voice full of reverence, "It's beautiful." Henry giggled softly as a tiny, solitary snowflake drifted down and landed on the tip of his nose. "It's cold." They all laughed then, a quiet, warm sound that seemed to fill the entire Berry home. James rested a hand on the small of Mary's back. "We'll be all right," he said, his voice firm with new confidence. "The world's still up there, and we're almost back to it." Harry leaned against him, letting herself believe that hope fully, deeply. Below them, the fire blazed warmly. Above them, daylight filtered through the snow in a shimmering, fragile shaft. Between those two worlds, the world of elemental cold and the world of nurtured warmth, the Carters stood together. Safe. Warm. Waiting for the moment they could rise back into the open air. Throughout the rest of that morning, the shaft of dim daylight remained a steady presence. It was thin, but faithful. Its soft glow pulsed gently through the narrow tunnel James had carved. The light had a profound, calming effect on the family. It was as if the sky itself had reached a benevolent hand down through the snow. It offered a silent reassurance: "I am still here. You are not forgotten." The digging done for now, James brushed the snow from his coat and joined Mary near the fire. The warmth had grown stronger. The flames were almond bright, their glow turning the wooden walls a rich, honeyed gold. Henry rolled his wooden horse slowly along the rug, humming to himself. Clara sat nearby, her doll resting in her lap. She watched the snow tunnel with a quiet, deep fascination. "It's like a secret," she whispered to Mary. "A hidden little window that only we know about." Mary smiled, smoothing the child's sleep minus tousled hair. "Sometimes winter gives us these small places of light," she said gently, "or we just have to be patient enough to find them." James checked the seams of the room again, the corners, the door frame, the small places where drafts had once slipped in. And now everything felt still, sealed tightly by the immense weight of the snow outside. Strangely, that very weight seemed to press the warmth inward. It was turning the little house into an even snugger cocoon. Still, there was something eerie about the quality of the quiet. No wind, no shifting snow, no distant call of a bird. Just the deep, muffled silence of a world sleeping under a thick, white shroud. Puffin stood by the hearth, staring into the flames. "Never seen a storm settle this heavy," he murmured, more to the fire than to Mary. "Not in all my years on this prairie." Mary paused from slicing bread, the knife hovering. "Ah, will it melt quickly when the weather softens?" He shook his head slowly. "Not snow like this. It'll take days of clear skies, maybe longer." She absorbed the words, taking a steady, thoughtful breath. "We're prepared," she said. "The statement simple and strong. We'll make it last." The lunch was simple warm bread, a little precious butter, a scant spoonful of jam saved from summer. The sweetness of it lifted their spirits. It filled the room with a gentle, ghostly memory of orchard days and warm breezes. Even in the heart of winter, the memory of sunlight had its own peculiar power to warm the heart. After they ate, James sat the children near him and began to whittle by the fire. Soft, fragrant curls of wood fell into a neat pile as he carved a small, shapeless block into the suggestion of a bird. The children watched in wide-eyed wonder, the simple magic of creation holding them rapt. Henry asked Papa, "Does the snow make everything quiet because it's listening?" James chuckled, a warm, low sound. "Maybe so, Henry. Maybe so. Snow likes to soften the world. It wants to make everything peaceful." Mary folded laundry by the rocking chair, her thoughts drifting as she listened to the soft symphony of home. The scrape of James's knife against wood, the crackle and pop of the fire, the occasional contented giggle from the children. But behind those warm, proximate sounds lay the ever-present hush of the outside world. It was so complete, it felt like a heavy blanket had been draped over the roof. A muffled thump came from above, the kind of gentle shift only deep snow makes as it settles. The children glanced up, their eyes seeking the source. James lifted a calming hand. "Just the drifts shifting their weight," he assured them softly, "like clouds settling in the sky." Mary nodded, her voice matching his calm. "Nothing to worry about." Time moved with a strange, elastic slowness in the quiet. The minutes stretched like the long winter shadows that would have fallen outside if they could only see them. The dim, snow-shrouded calm, the Carters found their rhythm again. Warmth, routine, togetherness. For though the world was buried and still, life inside the little cabin continued. It was as steady and as sure as the beating of a heart beneath winter's deepest, most silent dream. Afternoon settled into the cabin like a warm, heavy shawl. It was soft and thick with a hard -1 calm. Though the world outside remained sealed in its white silence, the hearth glowed with a comforting steadiness. Its flames curled upward in slow, graceful spirals. Each flicker cast a golden ripple along the walls. It turned the snow-packed windows into faintly glowing panels. It was as if the storm itself were reluctantly reflecting the fire's warmth back into the room. Mary sat in the rocking chair, mending a small tear in Clara's rag doll. Her needle moved with patient, precise stitches. Each one was tiny and neat, a repair meant to last. The rhythmic sway of the chair made a soft, familiar creak against the wooden floor. It was one of the few sounds not swallowed by the encompassing snow. James tended to the fire, rearranging the logs so the warmth would spread evenly. He worked slowly, savoring the feeling of usefulness. It was a solace to do something that mattered in their small, enclosed world. Clara lay on her stomach nearby, her chin resting in her hands as she watched him. "Papa," she asked, her voice thoughtful, "do you think the sun is shining on top of the snow?" James paused, then nodded thoughtfully. "I think so. I imagine it's very bright up there." "How bright?" Henry chimed in, scooting closer on the rug. James leaned back, letting a playful smile touch the corners of his mouth. "Bright enough to make the snow sparkle like a million tiny pieces of silver. Bright enough that if we were up there right now, we'd have to squint our eyes." Clara sighed, a sound of pure, dreamy longing. "I want to see it." "You will," Mary promised, her voice a soft melody in the glowing room. "When the world opens up for us again." Henry tapped his wooden horse lightly on the floorboards. "When will that be?" Mary set the mended doll aside and smoothed Henry's hair. "Soon enough, sweetheart. Winter moves at its own pace. We must move with it." The children returned to their play, singing a little, meandering tune between themselves. The gentle notes seemed to blend with the soft crackle of the fire, becoming part of the room's atmosphere. James joined Mary at the rocking chair, lowering himself into the seat beside hers. Their hands touched for a moment on the chair's arm, a brief, warm connection. The lantern's glow softened the tired lines on their faces. It eased the quiet worry that had lingered since the storm first began to rise. "You holding up?" he asked quietly, his eyes searching hers. Jerry nodded, though her eyes held a deep fatigue. "Better now, with the children calm, with you near." She paused, then added softly, "I'm glad the digging went well." "So am I," James said, "but we'll have to widen the tunnel tomorrow, maybe break through completely." He kept his voice low, not wanting to stir needless worry in the children. Mary's gaze drifted to the faint shaft of pale light still glowing from the tunnel above. "That little bit of daylight helped more than you know." James took her hand gently in his grip firm and reassuring. "He'll bring more of it down to us. You'll see." They sat together in a comforting, wordless stillness. It was broken only by the fire's soft purr and the children's quiet play. As the afternoon deepened, Mary prepared a pot of warm tea. Its aromatic steam drifted through the room in gentle tendrils. The herbal notes were soft and calming. She poured a small cup for James, then one for herself. She held her cup between her palms, soaking in the heat through the tin. The children received theirs with delight, mugs of steaming peppermint water, sweetened with a single, precious touch of honey. Clara blew on hers carefully, her cheeks puffing out. Henry giggled as the rising steam tickled his nose. For a while they all sat together around the hearth, sipping, resting, breathing in the quiet peace that filled the cabin like a living, breathing presence. Outside, the snow pressed in gently. It was as if the world had been muted under layers of white velvet. But inside was golden light, soft laughter, warm tea, and the enduring, unbreakable strength of family. In that small winter haven, wrapped in the steadfast glow of the hearth, the Carters felt, for a moment, safe beyond measure. As the afternoon faded into the muted gray of early evening, the Carters gathered even closer to the hearth. The fire had grown into a steady, comforting column of flame. It breathed, its dry warmth into every corner of the buried cabin. With the world outside locked in its snowy stillness, the family instinctively turned inward. They turned toward memory, toward togetherness, toward the gentle, sustaining rituals that kept the vastness of winter from feeling too large, too close. Mary pulled an old patchwork blanket from the storage chest. It was a quilt her mother had stitched long ago from squares of faded fabric. Remnants of dresses, shirts, and scraps of cloth that held their own quiet, forgotten stories. She spread it over the children, who snuggled beneath its weight with soft, contented sighs. James carved another delicate curl of wood from the small, bird-shaped figure he'd been working on. Clara and Henry watched it take shape with growing excitement. Henry leaned closer, his eyes wide in the firelight. "Is it going to fly, Papa?" James smiled softly, turning the little figure in his hands. "We'll fly in your imagination, son, and that's the very best kind of flying." Henry nodded solemnly, as though this were a profound and wonderful truth. Clara reached for the doll Mary had just repaired and hugged it tightly to her chest. "Mama," she said, her voice hopeful, "tell us a story." Harry glanced at James. He placed his carving aside and gave a quiet, approving nod. A story would be good. Something warm, something soft, something to fill the long, deep silence that pressed against the walls. So Mary settled herself near the hearth. The light cast a golden halo around her hair and face. She began to tell one of her childhood tales. It was a gentle story about a lantern spirit who wandered the winter woods. This spirit guided lost travelers home with its steadfast, unwavering glow. Her voice flowed slowly, soothingly. Each word was a soft thread, weaving a tapestry of comfort directly into the air of the room. The lantern spirit, she said, was made of starlight and humble flame. It liked to wander where the snow made everything quiet, where footsteps disappeared and the world held its breath. But it was never lonely, for it knew its light could help those who needed it most. The children listened, wrapped in complete attention. Their eyes shimmered, reflecting the firelight itself. James leaned back in his chair, letting the sound of Mary's voice wash over him. Stories had always been a part of winter. Not just entertainment, but a warmth of another kind. A warmth that fed the spirit, just as the fire fed their bodies. Outside, another soft shift of snow pressed downward with a deep warmth. But inside, Mary's words wrapped around them like a second, invisible quilt. The lantern spirit, she continued, never asked the night to be shorter, nor the storm to be gentler. It simply shone, bright enough to bring comfort, soft enough never to blind. And no matter how far it traveled, it always found its way back to where it belonged. Clara leaned her head against Mary's shoulder. "I like the lantern spirit," she whispered, her voice drowsy. Henry nodded sleepily. "It sounds like our fire." Mary kissed the tops of their heads, her heart full. "In a way, it is. All good. Brave light is related." James stoked the fire once more, listening as the story's final notes settled into the warm air. As the tale ended, a deep silence fell. But it was not heavy or cold, like the silence outside. It was peaceful, cushioned by the glow of the flames and the palpable, loving presence of family. They brushed Clara's hair gently from her forehead. "Should we sing a little?" Clara and Henry nodded eagerly, their fatigue momentarily forgotten. So Mary began to hum. It was a soft winter lullaby, familiar and slow, passed down through generations. James joined in, his low voice blending with hers. It was a harmony as natural as the sound of drifting snowflakes. The children swayed gently beneath the patchwork quilt. The song filled the cabin with a profound, resonant calm. The notes drifted upward, touching the rafters, brushing the faint shaft of daylight still lingering in the snow tunnel above. They warmed everything within their reach. In that little home, buried deep beneath winter's cold and heavy weight, the storm's silence transformed. It was no longer frightening. It was no longer isolating. It became serene, a vast, quiet backdrop against which their own small light glowed all the more deeply, all the more bravely. Wrapped in firelight and shared song, the Carters breathed in harmony with the quiet winter world. They were growing stronger, hour by hour, through the simple, ancient gift of being together. As evening deepened, the hearth's glow became an undeniable heart of the cabin. Its warmth reached outward in gentle, pulsing waves. The shadows lengthened across the floorboards. They were often blurred at the edges, moving like slow clouds drifting through a golden, miniature sky. The quilted blanket rustled lightly as Clara and Henry shifted closer together. Their small bodies were relaxed and sleepy beneath its familiar weight. James rose from his chair, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders with a soft groan. He moved toward the loft to check the tunnel once more. Even from below, Mary could see the faint, pale shimmer where daylight had once filtered through. Now, in the evening hours, that glow was dimmer. It was washed out to a soft, cool gray. It was barely noticeable except to eyes that had been trained by days of careful, hopeful watching. James climbed the ladder slowly. The wood creaked under his weight, a familiar, reassuring sound in the quiet. At the top, he leaned toward the tunnel's opening, brushing away a fresh dusting of snow from the frame's edges. A thread of cold air greeted him. It was crisp and delicate, like the touch of icy fingers against his skin. Still open, Mary asked softly from below, her face tilted upward. James nodded, his silhouette dark against the grayish light. Yes, the tunnel's holding. He examined the way the snow packed around the narrow passage, running a hand along its edge. He nodded thoughtfully to himself. Stable for now. Henry lifted his head from the quilt, curiosity sparking in his tired eyes. Papa, do you think animals are walking on top of the snow? James considered the notion, a small smile touching his lips in the darkness. Maybe a rabbit or two, he said gently. But it'll be hard for them too. The snow is very deep, Henry. Clara hugged her all, her voice a soft murmur. Maybe the lantern spirit Mama talked about is outside right now, watching over all the animals. Mary smiled softly at that, her heart warming at how quickly the children embraced metaphors of comfort. Perhaps, she said, perhaps it is, watching over all of us. James climbed down from the loft, brushing a light powdering of frost from his sleeves. As he returned to the hearth, Mary handed him a warm cup. It was mulled water, infused with a few slivers of ginger from their precious store. The steam curled upward in delicate tendrils, blessing his tired senses with both heat and a spicy, promising aroma. He took a sip, closing his eyes in a moment of pure, grateful appreciation. Perfect, he murmured, the word heartfelt. Mary sat across from him, smoothing her worn skirt over her knees. She watched the fire flicker and sway, its light dancing across the children's peaceful, trusting faces. Their eyelids were growing heavy, tiny breaths rising unfalling and soft, wave-minus like rhythms. Clara blinked slowly, fighting sleep. Mama, she whispered, what if the snow ever melts? Oh, it will, Mary said gently, her voice a sure promise. Snow always melts in time. But what if it takes a long time? A very, very long time? Story leaned down and kissed her forehead, her lips warm against the child's cool skin. Then we'll wait together, and we'll be warm and safe and full of stories until it does. The little girl nodded, comforted by the tenderness and the certainty in her mother's voice. James prodded the fire lightly with a poker, sending a small scattering of sparks swirling upward. We'll dig more tomorrow, he said. It was half to Mary, half a statement to the future itself. Once the light returns. Mary agreed, her voice steady. And we'll take it slow. There's no need to rush now. We have what we need. The snow above them shifted again. It was just a soft sound, like a great pillow being fluffed in another distant room. The house creaked under the changing, settling weight, but nothing gave way. Everything held firm. James listened, his head cocked slightly. It's all settling, he murmured, more to himself than to her. Should be stable enough by morning. Mary looked toward the loft, where the tunnel was now just a circle of deeper darkness. Do you think more snow will fall? He shook his head, his gaze distant as he considered the patterns he knew. The storm's past. The sky is probably clear as a bell now, but we're buried under what's already falling. That's the task. The children drifted a little closer to the fire, their eyelids fluttering. Clara's doll slipped slowly from her relaxing grasp. Henry's wooden horse came to rest beside him, a faithful companion in sleep. Harry dimmed one of the lanterns, conserving the last of its oil. Its glow softened to a gentle, pulsing amber. It seemed to merge with the firelight into one warm, seamless haze. Outside, the world was silent, still cold, but peaceful in its own frozen, stark way. Inside, the Carters were wrapped in the soft, living glow of fire-lightened family. They were protected from the vast, white world that lay above them. They were tired, but calm, chilled, but warmed from within, buried, but fire from last. And as the night settled in full, the cabin stood like a lantern itself. It glowed steady and bright, a tiny, defiant star beneath the deep, unbroken snow. Night's arrival inside the buried cabin was not a descent into shadows, but a gentle folding into softness, fired into a deep, radiant glow. The lone lantern flickered with a steady, sleepy pulse. The air itself felt gentler, as though winter, satisfied with its work, had finally wrapped the world in layers of profound quiet. Mary spread the patchwork quilt a little wider. She tucked it carefully around Claire and Henry as their small bodies finally surrendered completely to sleep. Their breaths came slow and deep, their cheeks rosy from the hearth's devoted heat. Clara's doll lay beside her, one young arm draped tenderly across the child's chest. Henry's wooden horse rested under his loosely curled hand, as though standing guard over his dreams. James rose from his chair and added one final, substantial log to the fire, caught quickly, sending a brief, warm flare through the room before settling into a comfortable, enduring burn. He watched the flames for a long moment, thoughtful, steady mind aside, grateful for something as simple and as essential as fire. "This is a long storm," Mary whispered into the quiet, voicing the thought that hung between them. James nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting the orange light. "One of the worst I've seen." He lowered his voice, its tones softening. "But the cabin's holding, and so are we." Mary smiled faintly. The reassurance, spoken aloud, helped. Even if the unknown still trembled like a faint, cold vibration beneath her palms, she could push it back. She rose, brushed her hands along her apron, and checked the kettle warming on the stove's edge. Steam curled from its spout in thin, elegant spirals that vanished into the dim air. "Tea?" she asked quietly. James nodded. "If you've got enough leaves left to spare." Mary poured 2 cups, measuring the precious dried leaves with frugal care. They sat together near the fire, sipping in a silence that felt more companionable than any conversation could have been. Outside, nothing stirred. Not a whisper of wind, not the call of a night bird, not a single crack or sigh. Only the occasional deep, muffled creak of snow settling further around the house broke the absolute stillness. James glanced up toward the loft. The tunnel was a darker patch in the gloom. "The opening looks stable for now," he said, answering her unasked question. Mary followed his gaze. The faint gray glow around the snow tunnel had faded completely, swallowed by the true night. Only darkness filled the narrow passage now. It was not frightening darkness, but a quiet one, like the rest of the buried world. "Tomorrow we'll see daylight again," Mary murmured, the words a hopeful incantation. James reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand. He gave it a gentle, affirming squeeze, steady and warm. "We will," he said, "and soon enough we'll climb through." Mary allowed herself to imagine it fully. The burst of shockingly cold air on her face, the almost painful brilliance of the sun on endless, untouched white, the sight of their home half submerged, like a ship stranded in a gentle, frozen sea. She imagined Clara's squeal of delight, Henry digging with sudden, enthusiastic energy, the sky stretching widened, impossibly blue above them all. Hope, warm and liquid, softened the hard corners of her anxious thoughts. A quiet pop from the fire broke the hush. It sent a small spray of sparks dancing up the chimney like escaping fireflies. The sound drew both their gazes, grounding them firmly in the present moment. The warmth, the light, the safety, the profound closeness. Mary leaned her head against James's solid shoulder. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her gently against the warmth of his side. The rocking chair swayed with the faintest whisper of movement, its rhythm soothing, untimeless. "It's strange," Mary said softly, her words muffled slightly against his coat. "Being buried like this. It feels like the whole world is asleep, and we're the only ones awake inside it." James nodded, his chin brushing her hair. "Maybe it is. Maybe winter needs its rest too, and we're keeping watch over its sleep." Their soft laughter warmed the space between them, a tiny, shared defiance. Mary looked down at the children, her dreams peaceful beneath the quilt's faded patterns. "I hope they remembered this part," she whispered. "The warmth, the stories, not just the fear." "They will," James assured her, his voice a low rumble in his chest. "Children remember the light more than the dark. They always do." Mary took comfort in that. It felt like a truth carved from experience. The fire glowed lower. The lantern flickered gently, its flame growing thin. The cabin, snug under its immense blanket of snow, felt almost like a secret chapel, a hidden place protected by silence itself, by the very thing that had once seemed so threatening. Slowly, James and Mary drifted towards sleep. Their breaths fell into unison with the breath of the house. The warmth of their bodies mingled with the lingering warmth of the fire. Together, they held back the cold night, and above them, the miles of snow rested in soft, absolute stillness. It was like a great, white sky turned upside down and tucked upon their roof, peaceful at last. When morning returned, it did so with such quiet subtlety that it was difficult at first to tell if night had ever ended. The cabin remained wrapped in a muted, gray gloom. The snow blocked every window, every crack, every conceivable place where dawn might otherwise have crept in. But James, stirring first, felt a shift, something in the quality of the silence, something in the new, faint coolness brushing his cheek. It was a whisper of change, subtle but undeniable. He opened his eyes and blinked at the loft. There, the faintest suggestion of pale light reached down through the tunnel, a bright, not even clear, but gentler than the profound black of night. It was as if the world above had exhaled slowly, releasing a single, soft breath of dawn through the dense, frozen filter. Sari awoke moments later, sitting up with a soft stretch that spoke of stiff muscles. Her gaze drifted upward, following his. Oh. A delicate glow shimmered faintly around the rim of the snow shaft. Morning, she whispered, the word a prayer of gratitude. Morning, James replied, the same feeling in his voice. On the floor near the hearth, the children began to stir. Clara's eyelashes fluttered like moth wings as she shifted beneath the quilt. Henry, still instinctively clutching his wooden horse, yawned so wide it echoed softly in the quiet cabin. Is it today? Clara asked drowsily, her mind still tangled in sleep. Can we dig the rest of the way today? James smiled gently, the expression visible in the growing white. We'll see what the snow gives us, little one. But we'll try. Henry rubbed his eyes with small fists. Is the sun up there? Mary brushed the boy's sleep-minus-must hair from his forehead. Yes, love. She's waiting for us. She's been there all along. The fire had burned low through the night, its embers glowing like a constellation of quiet, red coals beneath a blanket of pale ash. James stoked it carefully, adding small sticks and then a larger log. The flames rose slowly, stretching upward with warm, reaching fingers. The smell of pine smoke mingled with the faint, sweet smell of dried apple. Mary had stirred a handful into their morning porridge. The simple, homely aroma filled the room. It was a reminder. Despite the world above being hidden, life within these walls still moved forward. It persisted. James climbed halfway up the loft ladder to inspect the snow tunnel. This time, he felt a stronger current of cold air brush against his face. It was brisk but steady, a genuine draft. The faint light was stronger too, though still filtered through layers of snow. It had lost its ghostly grayness. It now held the barest hint of gold. Mary stood below him, watching, her hands clasped loosely. Do you think it's settled? She asked, her voice hopeful. Pours ran his hand along the packed snow wall of the tunnel. It felt firm, almost sculpted. Feels firmer today, he murmured. Still heavy as lead, but stable. He paused, listening with his whole body. No shifting so far. He moved back down the ladder and looked at Mary. His eyes held a quiet, determined light. After breakfast, I'll widen the tunnel. Slow work, but we'll get there. The children beamed, their residual fears softened by the presence of this new, promising light. They ate together, warmed by the fire, by the food, by the slow but certain return of day. Clara pressed her fingers against the warm wood of her bowl, feeling the heat seep into her small hands. Henry kept glancing up at the loft as if expecting the sun to come bursting through at any triumphant moment. When they finished, James collected his tools once more. The small hand -X, the spade, the shovel. He checked the handles, the edges, his movements ritualistic and sure. Jerry wrapped a thick, woolen scarf around his neck, even though he would not be fully stepping into the outside cold. Just in case, she said softly, smoothing the fabric at his collar like a blessing. James leaned down and kissed her forehead. A brief, warm touch. I'll be careful. He climbed the ladder once more. At the top, he knelt by the narrow opening and began to work. Gentle, measured movements shaved thin layers of snow away. He was widening the passage from a thin, breathing shaft into something more substantial. Snow drifted down in small, soft cascades. Clara and Henry giggled as it dusted their hair and shoulders. "It's like it's snowing inside." Clara laughed. The sound bright and sudden. Harry smiled as she swept the delicate flakes into a small, tidy pile by the hearth. Only just a little. And only today. Above them, the faint glow brightened barely, but unmistakably. It was a shy, muted promise. The world was returning. The Carters watched, breath held, as James worked. Each careful scoop brought them 1 inch closer to the surface, 1 inch closer to open air, 1 inch closer to the sun. Beneath the immense weight of winter, hope brightened. It was like the first, faint ray of a dawn they could not yet see. Quiet, steady, patient, and inside, their snow minus buried home, the family breathed with it. James worked with a slow, deliberate patience. He lifted, scraped, and carved. Each motion was smooth and steady, designed to keep the snow from shifting suddenly. The children watched from below with a quiet, thrumming excitement. Their eyes were fixed on the narrow shaft above. Where once there had been only a dim glow, now a faint golden tint shimmered. The sun was out. They could feel it, if not on their skin, then in the changed quality of the light itself. It was warmer, richer, even through the insulating layers of snow. Henry pointed a mitten and hand upward. "It's brighter today." Cinnery smiled as she swept a fresh pile of fallen snow away from the floor. "Yes, love. The sun is doing her part. She's helping us." James paused to wipe his brow, though the air near the tunnel was icy. The work was tiring. His arms ached, and the cold bit at his fingertips. But the rising light, the mere idea of it, renewed his determination. He leaned forward again. Using the hand minus sacks, he gently broke through a thin, crusty layer of tightly packed snow. More flakes descended, glittering through the air like pale, weightless feathers. Clara laughed softly, a sound of pure delight. "It's snow minus rain," she whispered, christening the phenomenon. Mary's eyes drifted toward the loft. She watched the brightening hollow with a mixture of profound relief and awe. "Soon," she murmured to herself, the word a quiet vow. "Soon we'll see sky." James scraped away more snow, feeling the draft strengthen perceptibly. A sharper, fresher wind brushed past his face. It was still frigid, but it was unmistakably open air. It carried with it the scent of pure winter. Crisp, bright, and filtered by wooden wool. It was a scent that only came from a world not buried in silence. He paused and breathed it in deeply, letting it clear his head. "Not long now, Mary," he called down softly. "Bring me the shovel." She passed it up the ladder, and he took it carefully. With measured, broad strokes, he widened the opening. He scooped away small, manageable amounts of snow, letting each pile fall harmlessly into the loft below. Minutes drifted by, then more. The tunnel grew broader, brighter, steadily revealing more of the soft, golden glow from above. Suddenly, with one careful final push of the shovel, a stubborn cluster of packed snow gave way. A burst of actual sunlight pierced the shaft. Not filtered light, not reflected glow. Actual sunlight. Aim arrow, brilliant beam of pure gold streamed down into the loft. It cut through the dimness of the buried cabin like a blade of light. The beam glittered with a million suspended snow crystals. They turned into drifting sparks of illumination that danced as they fell. Clara gasped loudly, her hands flying to her mouth. "Mama, look!" Henry clapped both hands over his own mouth, as though afraid the light might disappear if he made a sound. Mary's heart fluttered, a warm, expansive feeling in her chest. Her eyes shone with unshed tears. The cabin, once dim and muted, now glowed with a gentle, heavenly radiance in that one sacred spot. James leaned back on his heels to admire the small miracle. "There it is," he said quietly, reverence in his voice. "We've reached the surface snow." The sunbeam stretched downward. It illuminated the loft's dusty boards, and spilled softly over the edge of the ladder. It lit the children's upturned faces, warming their cheeks with its intangible touch. Henry stretched his hand into the very edge of the beam. He marveled at the way his small fingers seemed to glow from within. "It's warm," he whispered, as if sharing a great secret. Harry hugged him close. Her own face turned toward the light. "That's the sun saying good morning to you, Henry." James continued widening the opening a little more. He was careful not to break too large a hole at once, but he carved enough to allow more sunshine to trickle down. Soon, the loft shimmered with light. Not enough to climb through yet, but enough to feel the palpable presence of the sky. It was enough to lift the family's spirits in a way that food or fire alone never could. When James finally descended the ladder, breathless and tired, but smiling broadly, Mary touched his frosted cheek. "You've brought the day back to us," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Just doing what we must," he answered softly, though a clear, quiet pride warmed his voice. Above them, sunlight continued to pour through the narrow tunnel. It was pure, golden, hopeful. It was proof. Winter, no matter how deep or heavy, could not hide the world forever. The sunlight that streamed into the loft brought with it a renewed, almost electric sense of purpose. The golden beam shimmered like a tangible promise. It caught every tiny speck of falling snow, turning them into drifting flecks of captured fire. For the first time since the blizzard began, the Carters felt the world above them. It was not an unreachable dream. It was something they could touch, something they had literally reached. James rested only a short while before returning to the ladder. New determination shone quietly in his eyes, hardened by the sight of the sun. Pfeffy handed him a small piece of bread and some dried apple to eat as he worked. The children watched eagerly, their tiny faces glowing in the reflected new light. "Be careful," Mary whispered, the old warning now layered with hope. James nodded, gripping the sides of the ladder with steady, sure hands. "Always." He climbed once more into the loft, where the narrow shaft now glowed like the throat of a golden lantern. The cold from above was sharper now, more direct. It carried with it the clean, frigid, bright sun of open sky. James reached up with the small hand shovel. He widened the opening bit by meticulous bit. Each careful scoop sent another swirl of glittering snowflakes stumbling downward. Henry stomped his little boots in place, laughing softly. "It's raining sunshine." Clara clapped her hands, her eyes wide with the wonder of it. "It's like magic. Real magic." Harry smiled at their joy, her heart swelling as she watched their spirits, so long subdued, finally take flight. After days and nights of demons, even this thin slice of sunlight felt like a miracle bestowed upon them. James worked patiently. He carved the tunnel wider and higher, sending little avalanches of loose snow drifting to the floor below. He paused often to check the weight, to listen for shifting, to ensure the snowpack stayed firm. Finally, after long, careful effort far longer than any of them could have counted, James felt his shovel break into something new. Not snow, not ice. Air. Wide, open, unrestricted air. A sudden rush of pure, freezing wind poured through the hole. It carried with it a burst of dazzling, blinding brightness. The shaft filled with golden light, so intense that James had to shield his eyes for a moment. He pushed one more time. The last, thin crust of snow gave way, falling inward in a soft, sparkling shower that filled the loft with luminous powder. Above him the sky opened. Vast, brilliant, breathtakingly, painfully blue. The sunlight poured down like a warm, visual blessing, flooding the loft in radiance. For a moment, the entire cabin seemed to shift under the glow. It felt warmer, larger, freer. James exhaled a shaky breath, the sound pure relief. He called down, his voice thick with awe and triumph. "We're through." Marie clasped a hand to her mouth, her eyes welling over. Claire and Henry squealed and rushed to the base of the ladder. Let us see. Let us see." Careful, James warned gently, his voice laughing. One at a time. Harry steadied them as they climbed, their excitement trembling through their small bodies. Clara reached the loft first. She gasped as the full beam of sunlight kissed her cheeks. Henry climbed just behind her, his small hand gripping the ladder tightly. They stared upward, their mouths forming perfect, silent circles of wonder. Through the opening, the world dazzled. Blinding white snow stretched in smooth, endless drifts. Frost sparkled like a field of crushed diamonds, and above it all hung a vast, flawless sky. It was brilliant, endless, impossibly, perfectly blue. Oh, Clara breathed, the word a sigh of pure, it's so big. Henry reached out toward the light, his face glowing with its reflection. The sky came back. Harry climbed up behind them, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the expanse above. She rested a hand on James's shoulder, her voice trembling with the force of her relief. "We're not lost anymore." James squeezed her hand gently, his own eyes shining. "No, Mary, we never were." In that moment, surrounded by sunlight and sparkling snow, the family felt something warm and solid bloom inside them. It was a gentle, quiet triumph. They had endured the blizzard's fury. They had survived its deepest, smothering drifts. And now, they stood at the doorway to the open world once more. They were still buried. They still had immense digging to do. But the hardest part, the waiting, the darkness, the suffocating uncertainty had begun to melt away, was dissolving under the certain, glorious reality of the sky. They stood together, bathed in gold, gazing upward at a world reborn in winter light. The brightness above was almost overwhelming. It was as if the sky, after days of being hidden behind the storm's gray wrath, had returned with all its pent-up brilliance at once. James squinted up into the sparkling world beyond their improvised tunnel. He let his eyes adjust to the sudden expanse of blue and the blinding reflection of sunlight on untouched drifts. Mary held Clara and Henry close beside her in the loft. Their small faces were illuminated, painted with the rosy, healthy glow that only true daylight can bestow. "Is it safe to climb up?" Clara whispered, her voice full of yearning. James nodded thoughtfully, brushing loose snow from the ragged edge of the opening. "We'll go slow. I'll test the ground first." He cleared more snow from the rim of the tunnel, widening it just enough to slip his shoulders through. Then, with a careful, powerful grip on the frame, he hoisted himself upward until his head and shoulders breached the surface. The cold wind kissed his face with a sharp, clarifying clarity that carried the crisp, almost sweet scent of frozen air and newly fallen snow. For the first time since the storm began, he saw the prairie, or rather, he saw what was left of it. The world stretched in every direction, an unbroken plain of white. Fences, hedges, the old trail leading southward were gone. They were buried so deeply that even their tallest posts had vanished beneath the storm's heavy, sculpting hand. The Carter home sat entirely submerged. It was visible only by the single, man-made opening James had created. The sunlight shimmered across the drift, turning the snow into a sea of glittering frost. It rippled gently as the wind brushed over its surface. James let out a slow, steaming breath. "It's deep," he murmured, the assessment drifting down to Mary. "Deeper than I've ever seen." Mary's anxious gaze met his from below. "How bad?" He managed a reassuring smile, though the scene was daunting. "I'll manage." The roof held strong. The snow's packed tight. It won't collapse in on us. He scanned the horizon, his eyes narrowing against the glare. The storm's past. The sky's clear. That's the main thing. Satisfied, he pulled himself fully onto the surface, kneeling atop the packed drift. The snow crunched solidly under his weight. It was firm, dense, supportive enough that he didn't sink more than a few inches. He tested it with his hand, pressing down. Solid, hard minus packed by days of relentless wind and bitter cold. A very good sign. Below, Henry bounced with contained excitement. "Mama, can we go up too, please?" Harry hesitated, looking from her son's eager face to James's, high above. "Let Papa make a path first, sweetheart, just to be sure." James used the shovel to widen the opening around the tunnel, carving out a small, flat ring of space. Snow flew in soft, sparkling arcs as he worked. It glittered in the sunlight before settling like feathers. Then he leaned down, his face framed by bright sky. "All right," he said, his smile clear and warm. "Who's first?" Clara's hand shot up instantly. "May." James helped her climb the ladder, steadying her as she cautiously poked her head through the opening. The moment her face met the open breeze, she gasped softly. Her eyes widened, and her cheeks turned a rosy, vibrant pink. "It's cold," she whispered, but her smile was enormous. "But it's so beautiful." With a final, gentle lift, James helped her onto the surface. She wobbled for a moment, finding her balance on the strange, crunchy ground. Then she looked around, spinning slowly, utterly struck by the quiet brilliance stretching in every direction. Henry climbed next, squealing with glee as the cold air brushed his nose. "The sky is so big, it's eating everything." Mary followed more slowly, lifting herself through the opening with James's steadying hand. When she emerged into the full, unimpeded sunlight, tears pricked the corners of her eyes. They were not from sadness, but from the sheer, overwhelming relief of seeing the open world again. Vast, bright, familiar. "Thank God," she breathed. The words carried away on the breeze were really out. The four of them stood together atop their buried house. They were on their tiny, human-made island of packed snow. The wind whispered past, carrying a calm so deep it felt sacred. No bird call, no distant animal cry, just the soft, endless hush of winter breathing across the prairie. James wrapped an arm around Mary's waist, pulling her close against the cold. "Her step's done," he said softly, his voice filled with satisfaction. "Now we make the rest of the path." Henry stamped his little boots in place, giggling as snow puffed around his feet like tiny clouds. Clara shielded her eyes, scanning the impossible horizon. "Where is everything?" she asked, her voice full of wonder. James looked across the blank, magnificent expanse. "It's all there," he said, his voice certain, "just resting under the snow, waiting." They stood together like explorers on a new white planet. White aside, cold minus cheeked, hearts full to bursting. Their buried home waited below. The endless winter stretched above, but sunlight was at last upon their faces, and in that glowing, triumphant moment, they felt something warm and fierce ignite in their chests. Hope was rising. It was a flame, steady and bright, against the longest winter silence. The wind that morning was a kind of presence. It brushed gently across the open prairie, carrying cold with it, but a cold that felt clean and honest. It was a quiet cold, the kind that swept across the snow in soft, visible waves. It stirred shimmering crystals across the drifts, making them move like dust on polished glass. James stood tall atop the buried roof, scanning the horizon with a practiced, knowing eye. Though every familiar landmark had been erased beneath the storm's uniform blanket, he still knew the land by heart. He knew the subtle dip where the creek ran. He knew the gentle rise where the old barn stood. He knew these things in his bones. Even when the snow offered no visible clues, Mary tightened her shawl around her shoulders, the wind playfully tugging at the loose ends. She watched her husband with quiet confidence. She trusted the way he read the land, a language learned through years of labor and love. Clara took careful, experimental steps across the hard minus-packed crust. She was amazed at how the snow felt firm and reliable beneath her boots. Henry followed with less caution, stomping with enthusiastic vigor. Each stomp sent tiny, sparkling puffs into the crisp air. "What are you looking for?" Clara asked, peering up at James's pensive face. "Landmarks," he replied, his gaze still sweeping the white sea. "Something to tell me where the barn sits, and the well, even the old fence line." Henry squinted, his face a picture of confusion. "But it's all snow." James smiled softly at the boy's literal mind. "It is," he agreed. "And even snow has a shape if you know how to look. Look there." He pointed to a slight, almost imperceptible swell in the drift several yards away. "That's where the barn roof meets the air. See how the snow curves a little differently there, like the top of a very soft hill. Clara stared, her focus intensifying. Slowly, the shape became clearer, emerging from the blankness. "See it," she said, a note of triumph in her voice. Harry followed James's gaze and let out a careful, hopeful breath. If the barn roof is that close to the surface, the animals, they might be all right. James squeezed her shoulder gently, a gesture of shared hope. "We'll check after we clear our own path, one thing at a time." He walked a few steps outward from their opening, testing the snow's strength with each placement of his boot. Each step sank only an inch or two. "Good," he murmured. "The wind compacted it. It'll hold." Henry tried to imitate his father's long, sure strides, but his smaller feet got tangled, and he toppled sideways into a soft, powdery mound. Clara giggled as she helped him up, brushing snow from his coat with affectionate pats. Harry stood near the opening, watching James carefully as he walked a wider circle. "Don't go too far alone," she called, her mother's instinct strong. "Just testing the ground," he answered, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet air. Mapping the way, he traced a slow circle around the buried house. He marked the edges of the roof by sight and feel. He tapped the snow with the butt of the shovel, listening for hollow sounds that would warn of thin spots or hidden voids. His movements were measured, deliberate, the actions of a man who respected the power of the elements. When he returned, he knelt beside the opening, his breath forming quick clouds. "We'll need a ramp," he said, thinking aloud. "A proper path leading up from the tunnel so we don't have to climb like spiders every time." Mary nodded, seeing his plan instantly. "We can pack the snow down ourselves." "Yes," he agreed, and cut steps into it for stability. Henry puffed out his small chest. "I can help pack." Clara lifted her chin, her expression proud. "Me too," James chuckled, the sound warm in the cold air. "And let's get started. We've got a world to rebuild." They worked together, slowly, patiently. James carved into the snow with the shovel's sharp edge, forming a sloped path down from the roof to the tunnel's mouth. Harry followed, using her boots to press the loosened snow into firmness. Clara followed her mother's steps carefully, doing her earnest best to flatten the surface. And Henry used his small, mitten-edged hands to pat down the edges, taking his task with grave seriousness. The sunlight warmed their faces, a faint but perceptible heat. It made their breath spuff like tiny, earnest clouds as they worked. The sky above was endless, brilliant, stretching in a dome of crystalline blue that felt almost unreal after days of great immense. For a moment Mary paused. She lifted her face to the sun, closing her eyes. The warmth was faint but profoundly comforting. It was like a long-lost friend, finally returning after a terrible journey. "We're blessed," she whispered, not to anyone in particular. James glanced up from his shoveling, following her gaze. "A sky like this means the cold will hold, but no more snow for now." "That's the best news we could have." They worked until a small but serviceable ramp was formed. It was a safe, sturdy slope connecting the roof line to the open world. It wasn't beautiful or perfect, but it was functional. It would let them climb and undoubted with ease, bringing tools, carrying supplies. Thora clapped Hermit and Ned hands together. "We made a way." Henry bounced in place, unable to contain his joy. "Now we can go outside whenever we want." Harry chuckled softly, pulling them both into a brief, snowy hug. "Not too far, my adventurers. But yes, we can. This is our front door again." James rested a hand on each child's shoulder, his face serious but his eyes kind. "This is only the beginning," he said warmly. "We'll clear more paths. We'll dig to the barn. We'll make our whole world open again." Below them, their home waited warm, secure, held tightly beneath the snow, but no longer sealed away. Above them stretched a glistening sea of white, a world transformed, but still irrevocably their world. Step by step, sevel by sevel, breath by breath, they would reclaim it. With the small ramp in place and sunlight warming their faces, the Carters felt steadier, more anchored to the world above. But James knew their next task was urgent, a debt of care that could not wait. The animals in the barn had endured the storm too. They were buried just like the family, beneath mountains of silent snow. If they were still alive, they would need food, water, and fresh air desperately. He scanned the shimmering landscape again. His eyes narrowed at the subtle swell in the snow several yards away, the one he had pointed out to Clara. "There," he said softly, his voice sure. "That's where the barn roof is lying. You can see the pitch of it in the snow's curve." Mary followed his gesture, studying the contours and shadows on the snow's surface. The faint trace wasn't obvious to an untrained eye, but once she found it, she saw how it stretched along a smooth ridge beneath the white sea. It was like the spine of a giant, slumbering creature. "Are you sure?" she asked, needing the confirmation. James nodded, his gaze never leaving the spot. "Positive. The barn roof is pitched. The house is flat. That," he pointed again, definitive. "That's a peak." Clara held Herd all close, her expression suddenly sober. "Are the animals scared?" Mary tucked a wind-blown strand of hair behind Herd Otter's ear. "Maybe a little, sweet pea. But they're strong. And soon they'll hear us coming. They'll know help is here." Henry tugged at James's coat, his face earnest. "Papa, can I come?" James knelt down so he was at eye level with the boy. Not this time, son. The snow might be softer near the barn, less packed. I need to check it first. Make sure it's safe." Henry's face fell slightly, but he nodded bravely, understanding the gravity. "Okay, but you'll tell them I said hi?" James smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "I will. I'll give them your regards." Mary touched James's arm. "I'll come with you. Someone needs to watch your steps. And 2 shovels are better than 1. He hesitated, but only for a moment. Gary had always been steady, sure, minus-footed, pragmatic on the prairie. "All right," he agreed softly. "But stay behind me, and step only where I step." Clara and Henry waited near the tunnel opening, a solemn little sentry duty. The parents moved slowly across the snow, a pair of dark figures against the blinding white. James tested each step, pressing his weight gradually before committing to it. Mary mirrored him a pace behind, her shawl fluttering gently in the cold breeze. The sun shone brightly overhead, its rays turning the snow into a glittering field of a million tiny diamonds. Each step crunched softly beneath their boots, the sound crisp and delicate in the vast quiet. As they approached the barns, Barry drew flying. James crouched low. The swell was more pronounced here, rising a full 2 feet above the surrounding snow. He brushed the surface gently with his gloved hand. "Packed tight," he murmured, assessing. "Wind must have swept the snow hard against this side, sealed it like a plaster." Carrie knelt beside him, her breath visible. "Would hold our weight?" "For a careful walk, yes. But we'll need to dig from the top down to make an opening. We can risk the walls caving in." He tapped lightly with the shovel handle, listening intently for hollow echoes. None came, just the dense, muffled thud of deep, settled snow. "We'll start here," James decided. He lifted the shovel and began carving away small, manageable chunks of snow from the crest of the buried roof. He was exposing, little by little, the gentle angle of the structure beneath. Each piece of snow fell away softly, creating miniature avalanches that shimmered in the sunlight. Mary used her net hands to scoop away the loosened snow, pushing it aside into neat, growing mounds. Their breath filled the air with faint, persistent clouds. The cold burned at their cheeks, but the work warmed their bodies from the inside with purpose. Back near the house, Clara held Henry's hand tightly. They watched with wide, unblinking eyes, whispering to each other as their parents slowly revealed more of the barn's hidden shape. "Do you think the cow is lonely?" Henry asked, his voice small. Maybe," Clara replied, her tone thoughtful. "But Papa and Mama are going to find her. They always find what's lost." Henry nodded, accepting this as absolute truth. "They always find us." Bit by bit, the barn's rich pall became visible. First, a dark line of weathered wood. Then, the faint, overlapping outline of shingles under a thin, brittle crust of ice. The sight filled Mary with a surge of hope so strong it felt like a physical warmth. "They're alive under there," she whispered, the conviction solid in her voice. "They must be." James worked faster now, guided by the tangible structure beneath his hands. We need to make a vent first. If the drift filled everything tight, they'll need air more than anything. Mary passed him the smaller hand shovel, and together they widened the exposed section. They worked until James could chip a small opening, an arrow slit between two shingles where the snow had pressed with particular force. A faint, warm breath of air puffed outward from the darkness. Damp, earthy, carrying the unmistakable scent of high-owned living animal breath. Inside, warmth, life. Mary's eyes filled with sudden hot tears. They're alive. James leaned closer to the slit, his ear almost against it. He listened, holding his own breath, and then he heard it. A soft, muffled, weary moo. Weak but unmistakable. The cow. Mary pressed a hand to her heart, as if to steady its wild, joyful beating. Oh, thank God, thank God. Oh, James stood up tall, his face transformed by determination and relief. They'll take the rest of the way down to a door, he said, his voice firm with new energy. We'll open a way for them. We'll get them fed and watered properly. Terry wiped hurt ears on the back of her woolen glove and nodded, her own resolve hardening. Let's bring them back into the light. And with renewed strength, the Carters worked beneath the bright winter sky. They were cutting a path through the snow, not just for themselves, but for the silent, waiting creatures who depended on them, breath by breath. Shovel by shovel, they were reclaiming their world, one buried, breathing peace at a time. The cow's faint, muffled low still echoed in Mary's ears as she unjames dug. It wasn't loud. It wasn't desperate or panicked. It was soft and warm and enduring. It was like a lantern's flicker pushing through a long dark tunnel. It was proof of life, proof that their animals had weathered the storm just as bravely, just as stubbornly as they had. James carved steadily along the barn's buried roof line. He worked his way down toward what he hoped was the small loft vent. The snow was thick, but tightly packed. It held firmly, like carved alabaster, beneath each cut of his shovel. Mary scooped the loosened snow aside, her breath spuffing in quick, white clouds in the cold. The sun warmed their backs, though its warmth was more a promise than a tangible heat. Even so, its presence above them was a bolster, a silent cheerleader. After several minutes of focused digging, James paused. The loft door should be somewhere right here, he murmured, feeling along the buried angle of the barn's upper wall with his shovel. He tapped gently with the handle, listening. Thud, thud, then a different sound. Thud hollow. There, he said quietly, a note of triumph in his voice. Mary nodded, hope blooming in her chest like a small, hardy flower. Let's clear around it, gently, working together. They carved away enough snow to reveal a plank of weathered wood. It was part of the small, vented hatch near the roof peak, used for throwing down hay in the summer. James brushed off the last thin layer of frost and placed his gloved hand flat against the plank. It was warm, barely just the faintest hint, but noticeably warmer than the surrounding snow. The animal's body heat, he said gently, almost reverently. They're huddled together inside. Their warmth is keeping this spot from freezing. With careful, precise movements, he worked at the iron latch. It resisted, frozen shut from the outside by a glaze of ice. He tapped around its edges gently with the axe, loosening the frost crust piece by piece. Terry steadied herself on the roof slope as he worked, her gloved hands gripping the snowy surface. Finally, with a soft, yielding crack, the hatch gave way. A tiny rush of warmer, damp air escaped. It carried the rich, deep scent of hay, of manure, of living, breathing creatures. And then another sound came with it. Soft, relieved, deep minus-throated moo. Mary exhaled shakily. The sound half minus laugh, half minus sob. Oh, bless them, bless their brave hearts. James peered inside. Darkness met him at first, but as his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he could make out faint shapes. The animals were huddled together in the center of the barn floor, a dark mass of warmth. Their sides rose and fell slowly, calmly. Their collective warmth had kept the loft space above freezing. The snug, enclosed barn had shielded them from the storm's worst, biting winds. They're all right, he said softly, the relief profound in his voice. Weak, hungry, thirsty, but all right. Harry closed her eyes for a second, offering a silent, fervent thanks to whatever forces watched over humble things. Below them, the children bounced with contained excitement near the house's opening. Clara cupped her hands around her mouth. Papa, are they okay? Harry stood tall and called back across the glittering snow, her voice warm and clear with relief. They're safe. We found them. They're all safe. Clara and Henry cheered, their young voices ringing across the white expanse like the clear peal of tiny bells. James swine in the vent carefully, just enough to pass a small bucket of high-end skin of water through. As if Mary hurried back to the house to fetch both. When she returned, the children followed close behind, each carrying a small offering. Henry held a handful of hay clutched proudly in his mittens. Clara brought a little wooden scoop filled with precious grain. James smiled softly at their earnest, heartfelt contributions. All right, he said gently. One at a time. Let's not startle them. He lowered the hay into the vent first. Warm, moist breath brushed his hand from below. A soft, grateful rustle of movement followed. The cow Daisy nudged the offering with a hungry, but gentle insistence. Harry lowered the grain next, and carefully poured a small amount of water into a trough they could hear being nosed below. The animals drank greedily, the sound of their swallowing a beautiful music. Henry leaned as close to the opening as James would allow, whispering down into the barn's darkness. Hi, Daisy, we're here. We didn't forget you. He soft, affectionate grunted the shuffle of a hoof answered him. Clara giggled, the sound pure joy. I think she missed us. Mary brushed away the happy tears that now freely fell. They did, and we missed them. James closed the hatch gently, leaving it lightly ajar to let a continuous flow of fresh, cold air circulate inside. Then he turned to Mary. He was snow-minus dusted across his shoulders, sunlight bright on his face, his eyes clear and tired and utterly content. We saved them, he said softly, the statement simple and monumental. Terry reached for his gloved hand, and they held on, their linked hands a bridge between them. Bless their hearts, she whispered again. And bless ours. Together, the family stood atop the buried barn. The frozen world stretched quiet and bright around them. They knew they had reclaimed another vital piece of their life from the storm. One pocket of warmth, one heartbeat at a time, they were bringing their whole world back into the light. With the animals fed and breathing fresh air, a soft expanse of warmth spread through the Carters. It was a warmth no winter wind could ever touch. They stood together on the barn's snow-minus covered roof, looking across the pale, transformed landscape with new eyes. The world was still buried. It was still frozen. But it was no longer lost. It was a world they were actively saving, inch by hard -1 inch. James brushed snow from his coat, the sunlight catching on the crystals clinging to the wool. They sparkled like tiny stars before melting away. But we've done the most important part, he said, his voice carrying a quiet satisfaction. Now we make paths. Safe ones. Permanent ones. Mary nodded, her gaze sweeping over their little domain. For us. For the animals. For anyone else who might need help later. Clara and Henry stood proudly beside them, their small chests puffed out. They felt as if they, too, had helped save the entire farm from winter's grip. Henry stamped his little boots into the snow with deliberate joy, sending puffs of glitter into the cold air. Let's make paths everywhere, he declared as if commanding an army of snow. James chuckled, a warm, rich sound. One at a time, General. Snow, this deep takes patience. And a good, strong back. He led the way back toward the house, his boots crunching a confident trail through the top crust. The ramp they had built leading down to their tunnel was now sturdy and smooth -surfaced, while Minus packed underneath. Larry and Henry slid down it carefully. A soft, giggling descent that left faint, parallel marks on the snow. Harry followed, steady and graceful, gathering Hirsch all around her as she descended. At the base, she looked back up toward the bright sky and the glittering roofline of their buried home. It's strange, she murmured almost to herself, to see only the roof. It's like our whole life has shrunk down to just this little patch of wood and snow. James stood beside her, following her gaze. Winter hides what it wants to hide, he said thoughtfully. Ay, what it can't take what's inside. It can't take what's in here. He tapped his chest gently with a mittened fist. The children were already halfway back to the tunnel, calling out, come see what we drew. Inside the tunnel, the golden light from above made the narrow passage seem welcoming, almost magical. The snow walls sparkled faintly, as though embedded with 1,000 tiny crystals. It felt less like a tunnel now and more like a bridge, a deliberate passage they had built between two worlds. But when they reached the cabin's interior again, warm air wrapped around them instantly. It was the familiar, beloved scent of pine smoke, a faint stew of the lingering, comforting smell of the fire itself. Oh, we should rest a moment, Mary said, brushing snow from her skirt in a practiced motion, and warm up properly. The cold gets into your bones out there. The children didn't need convincing. They hurried to the hearth, where the fire glowed with a steady, inviting heat. Clara cupped her hands round her rosy cheeks, warming her fingertips. Henry pressed his boots close to the flames, sighing happily as the deep chill began to ease from his toes. James hung his coat near the stove to dry, the wool already steaming slightly. The weather's holding, he observed, more to himself than to anyone. We can work on the paths again after we get our strength back. No sense in rushing and making foolish mistakes. Harry poured warm peppermint water into tin cups, handing them around. The family sat together by the fire, the room brightened now by both firelight and the faint, golden shimmer reflecting down from the tunnel above. Tomorrow, James said, laying out the plan as he sipped, we'll widen the ramp, make it fit for carrying wood, water. Then we'll carve a proper path toward the well. A real trench, not just footsteps. Clara perked up, her tiredness forgotten for a moment. Will we clear all the snow everywhere? James smiled softly at the grand scale of her ambition. Not all, Clara minus girl, but enough to live, enough to move, enough to feel like this is our land again, and not just a prison of white. Harry touched his arm, her expression thoughtful. A path to the barn door too, so they can come out when the weather softens enough. They need to feel the sun just like we do. Exactly, he said, his voice firm with agreement. A yard for them, fenced by snow, but open to the sky. Henry took a sip of his warm drink, then asked with sleepy seriousness, will the snow get deeper again? Harry smoothed his hair, her touch gentle. Not today, my love. Not tomorrow. The sky's clear, Henry. The storm is done with us. James nodded, reinforcing her assurance. Storms like that don't come back quickly. They blow themselves out across the whole territory. We've got time now. Time to dig out. The fire popped softly, sending a single, bright spark drifting up toward the chimney. Claret ray shapes in the patina of light and shadow across the floor, little swirls, little suns, little houses. Henry dozed gently against Mary's side, his breath becoming deep and even. Outside, the world was still an endless, roaring sea of white. But inside, warmth bloomed. Light glowed. Voices softened into the comfortable silence of shared purpose. The Carters had climbed into winter's deepest silence and had returned safely. They were bringing hope back with them like a treasure salvaged from the deep. Step by step, breath by breath, they were reclaiming the world the storm had tried to hide. And tomorrow, they would carve more paths, long, shining trails across the snow, where sunlight could fall freely again, and where their footsteps would say, we are here, or we remain. Morning returned with a gentle certainty, shining down the tunnel like a soft, golden ribbon lay from heaven. The light woke the cabin slowly, touching each corner with a quiet, persistent promise. Today, the world grows wider. James rose first, stretching the tired protest from his muscles before stoking the fire to fresh life. The flames answered eagerly, pushing warm waves of air across the room in a familiar, beloved rhythm. One by one, the others stirred, Terry brushing her long hair back and plaiting it with swift, practical fingers. Clara sitting up with a jaw-minus cracking yawn. Henry hugging his wooden horse to his chest, as if it had guarded him through the night. Is it time? Henry asked, his voice still fuzzy with dreams. Time to work, James said with an affirming nod. and time to bring more of our home back into view. After a warm breakfast of porridge and the last of the dried apples, the family bundled themselves once more into their winter armor. Garbs, mittens, thick coats, worn soft at the elbows, boots packed with dry straw for insulation. But the air inside the cabin was cozy, thick with the smell of food and fire. But the world above was crisp, sharp, and brilliantly lit. Climbing the ramp felt easier today, almost routine. Their footprints from yesterday had created a shallow, packed path. The snow surface glittered under the high sun like a field of powdered glass. A light, playful breeze swept across the prairie, carried the faintest whisper of a sound that was not silence, but not yet noise. It was the sound of a world poised on the edge of waking. James began outlining the day's tasks with calm, clear authority. First, we widen this ramp. We need to be able to climb safely with tools, with buckets. Then we make a proper path to the barn door, not just the roof vent. After that, we start clearing the area around the well. We'll need to get to the water easily every day. Mary studied the snow-covered horizon, shading her eyes with a flat hand. It'll take all day, James. Perhaps longer. That's all right, he said gently, his gaze meeting hers. We've got the light, and we've got each other. That's all you've ever needed. Henry nodded solemnly, as if agreeing to a great and serious responsibility. I'll help stomp the snow, he said, his pride evident. I'm the best stomper. Clara lifted her chin, a mirror of her mother's determined expression. And I'll help Mama pack it down. We'll make it smooth as a board. Thea smiled, her heart swelling at their earnestness. Then we'll make quick work of it, with such a fine crew. James turned to face the immense drift surrounding their home. He hefted his shovel, its blade catching the sun. Let's begin. He shoveled with smooth, practiced movements, carving broad strokes from the ramp sides to widen it. Thea used her boots like living tools, pressing the loosened snow into a firm, walkable surface. The children followed behind, their small steps carefully placed. They smoothed the surface with attentive pats, laughing softly whenever a patch of snow puffed up like powdered sugar under their heels. The ramp widened steadily. It transformed from a narrow, personal entryway into a secure, sloping path. It became wide enough for all of them to travel side by side, or for James to carry a full bucket without fear of slipping. Next came the long, slow, satisfying work of clearing the way to the barn door. James traced the invisible line of the buried wall, where he knew the barn's entrance must be. Then he began digging downward, not across. Harry and the children became a chain of removal. They carried snow away in small, manageable loads, creating gentle, sparkling mounds that grew around them like tiny, crystalline hills. Hours passed in a quiet, focused rhythm. No wind, no rustling trees. Only the steady, metallic scrape of the shovel, the crunch of boots on snow, the soft whump of a load being dropped. Their breaths rose like tiny, personal clouds, drifting briefly before dissolving into the brilliant, dry air. Every now and then, James paused to listen. He pressed his ear to the snow near the barn wall, and each time a soft, reassuring shuffle or a contented, muffled low answered him from within. Harry hummed softly as she worked, an old winter tune her own mother had once sung. Clara picked up the melody, her voice bright and sweet, echoing with a strange, clear purity across the snowy stillness. Henry added little hums of his own, slightly offbeat but full of unadulterated joy. By mid-afternoon, they had carved an narrow but clear trench along the barn's front wall. Snow rose in tall, smooth banks on either side, making the path feel like a quiet corridor of white marble. It was a passage they had built with their own hands. James brushed away the last clinging coat of snow and uncovered the barn door's crossbeam. The familiar, weathered wood was a shock of dark brown against the white. There he is, he said, his breath visible in the cold. We're almost ready to open it properly. Mary looked down the length of their newly carved path. Her chest swelled with a tired, profound pride. We've done so much today, she said, her voice soft with wonder. It hardly seems possible. There's more to do, James replied pragmatically, but his eyes were kind. There's always more to do. but we'll do it together. That's what makes it possible." The children stood in the glowing afternoon light, cheeks rosy, mittens damp from work, eyes bright with the hard, clean satisfaction of accomplishment. Clara squeezed Henry's mittened hand. "We're making our world again," she said, stating it as a fact. He nodded, his expression serious. "Because we're strong, and we're together." Harry swept them both into her arms, hugging them close as James leaned his shovel against the barn wall with a definitive thud. The longest winter had buried their home. It had hidden their land. It had sealed them in silence. But step by step, shovel by shovel, they were rising through it. Outside, the world stretched wide and white and magnificent. Inside their hearts, something warm and steadfast and unbreakable grew stronger with every path they carved. The afternoon sun began its slow, glorious descent. It dipped lower in the winter sky, casting a pale, golden sheen across the drifts that turned every crystal into a speck of captured fire. The long trench leading to the barn door stood finished. It was a quiet, purposeful passageway, its walls sculpted by careful, loving hands and steady hearts. Every breath the carters took puffed gently into the cooling air. The little clouds drifted upward like tiny, transient ghosts, dissolving before they could reach the vast, darkening blue above. James stood before the barn door, brushing away the last, stubborn layer of snow packed around its heavy wooden frame. His gloves worst, if with a rime of frost. The breath from his lips formed soft, persistent plumes that settled briefly on his woolen coat before vanishing. Harry and the children watched from a few respectful steps back. Anticipation stirred in the space between them, a little living flame. "Here it is," James said softly, more to the door than to them. "The door's not frozen shut. That's a blessing right there." Harry stepped closer, reaching out to touch the familiar, weathered boards. The wood was cold, but solid. Its grain was as known to her as the lines on her own palm. She remembered storing summer hay here, the smell of warm, earthen dried grasses before winter had claimed the land utterly. Now, the barn felt like a treasure chest. It was buried beneath white waves, waiting to be opened, its precious contents held safe. "Can we open it now?" Clara asked in a small, breathless voice, barely louder than the breeze. James nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "But we'll do it carefully. The animals might be crowded near the door, keeping warm. We don't want to startle them or hurt them." Henry's eyes widened with the seriousness of it. "They'll be happy to see us," he stated, his faith absolute. Together, James and Mary pressed their hands to the wooden crossbeam. They lifted it free of its iron brackets. Gentle, aching cree echo sounded as the beam slid aside. It was a whisper of protesting wood that seemed oddly, profoundly loud in the vast quiet of the snowy prairie. James grasped the iron door handle. It was bitingly cold, even through his glove. He pulled. At first, the door resisted, its lower edge frozen lightly to the threshold of drift beneath. Then, with a low, groaning sigh, the barn door opened inward. It spilled a small, soft wave of displaced snow across the packed floor of the trench. Warm, dim, animal-scented air drifted out, and with it came the sounds, the soft rustling of hooves on earth, the gentle, massive shifting of a large body, a quiet, relieved, deep-chested moo. The cow, Daisy, stepped forward timidly, her ears flicked, twitching at the new, cold draft. She pressed her wet, black nose toward the open air, sniffing deeply. Behind her, the two goats watched with wide, curious, intelligent eyes. Their coats were fluffy and matted, warm from huddling. The barn interior was dim, lit only by the light pouring in from the door, but it was far from cold. It was thick with the animal's breath, with the insulation of deep hay, with the lingering, vital heat of living bodies pressed together. Mary pressed a hand to her heart, her eyes shining with unashamed tears. "Bless their dear, patient souls." Clara squealed softly, covering her mouth with her mitten to contain it. Henry waved enthusiastically, his whole arm moving. "Hi, Daisy. Hi, goats." Daisy blinked slowly, her long lashes dusted with bits of hay. She stepped closer, and the low, golden sunlight touched her red coat for the first time since the blizzard began. It turned the tips of her fur into glowing strands of copper and gold. James moved to the side, making respectful room for the animals to breathe the open air, to see the world again. They're weaker than usual, he observed gently, his experienced eye noting the slight sway in Daisy's stance. But they're safe. They're on their feet. They'll be fine with good care. Carrie knelt beside the doorway, her practical nature taking over. She scooped clean snow into a tin pail to melt for water later. We'll bring them fresh at night, and a warm mash. They've earned it. Clara leaned into Mary's shoulder, watching the cow with rapt attention. They look happy, she whispered. They are, Mary whispered back, brushing a kiss against Clara's cool temperature.